No apologies have been received. We're continuing our deliberations module on rapid antigen testing, specifically in relation to aviation and travel, resumed. Purpose of our meeting this morning is to resume a discussion on rapid antigen testing in relation to aviation and travel. On behalf of the committee, I would like to especially welcome today's meeting Dr. Tony Houlihan, Chief Medical Officer, Department of Health, Dr. Ronan Glenn, Deputy CMO, Department of Health, Professor Philip Nolan, Chair of the NPHET Modelling Group, Dr. Cillian de Gascon, a Consultant Virologist and Director of National Virus Reference Laboratory, Professor Mary Cogan. Is that pronounced correctly? Is it Kyogan or Kyogan?
It's Kyogan.
Professor Mary Kyogan, Consultant Immunologist and National Clinical Lead for Pathology, and Professor Martin Cormacan, Consultant Microbiologist and National Clinical Lead for Antimicrobial Resistance and Infection Control. You're all most welcome. Thank you all very much for coming today. Note on privilege, all witnesses are again reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identified person or entity, you will be directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction. For witnesses attending remotely outside the Leinster House campus, there are some limitations to parliamentary privilege, and such may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as witnesses physically present does. Witnesses participating in this committee session from a jurisdiction outside the state are advised that they should also be mindful of the domestic law and how it may apply to the evidence they give. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would like to remind members of the constitutional requirement that members must be physically present within the confines of the place which Parliament has chosen to sit, namely Leinster House and or the Convention Centre in Dublin, in order to participate in public meetings. I reluctantly will not permit a member to participate where they are not adhering to this constitutional requirement. Therefore, any member who attempts to participate from outside the precinct will be asked to leave this meeting. In this regard, I will also ask any member partaking via Teams that prior to making their contribution to the meeting that you confirm that you are on the grounds of the Leinster House campus. For anyone watching this meeting online, our Oireachtas members and witnesses are accessing this meeting remotely, only as chair and the necessary staff essential to the running of the meeting are physically present in the committee room. Due to these unprecedented circumstances, a large number of people attending the meeting remotely, ask for everyone's forbearance should any technical issues arise. And this is a hugely important meeting for the Irish public today, and we thank Dr. Houlihan and his colleagues for coming. We look forward to a very good engagement on the role that rapid antigen testing give alongside PCR testing, not mutually exclusive. We feel they have a role to play very much in aviation and travel. So with that, Dr. Houlihan, I'd ask you to make your opening statement. You're approximately about 5 minutes. Dr. Houlihan.
Very much indeed, Chair and members of the committee, and thanks for the invitation to attend the meeting. As you've said, you've given the list of people that I have with me. We've Dr. Ronan Glynn, Deputy CMO, Professor Philip Nolan, Chair of the Modelling Group, Professor Cillian de Gascon, Consultant Virologist and Director of the National Virus Reference Laboratory, Professor Mary Kyogan, Consultant Immunologist and National Clinical Lead for Pathology, and Professor Martin Cormacan, Consultant Microbiologist and National Clinical Lead for Antimicrobial Resistance and Infection Control. Chairman, I'm glad to report that the COVID-19 epidemiological situation in Ireland remains encouragingly stable and currently gives rise, from our perspective, to a broadly positive outlook, notwithstanding the ongoing level of uncertainty that we must express due to the threat of variants, which are a concern around the world, and while a significant portion of the adult population in this country still remains to be fully protected through vaccination, notwithstanding the good work of the HSE in that area. Our progress has been made possible largely due to the great sacrifices of people in this country who've continued high levels of adherence to the public health measures, their compliance with those public health measures. That is what has controlled this disease thus far, along with the progressive impact of the national vaccination programme. And we'll continue to target the public health response in order to most optimally, in our judgment, mitigate the impact of this pandemic, including as it relates to testing for SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that obviously causes COVID-19. However, breaking chains of transmission cannot be achieved through testing alone. Ultimately, breaking chains of transmission depends on the extent to which there is appropriate follow-on individual and public health actions implemented and supported by a wider comprehensive public health response, as I say, we have largely seen in this country. That said, access to timely and accurate COVID-19 testing is an essential component of a multifaceted response strategy which supports case identification, contact tracing, clinical management of cases, infection prevention and control, and disease surveillance, including in relation to emerging variants. In this country to date, SARS-CoV-2 virus has been primarily based on a robust and agile PCR testing capacity that has been built up to an approximately 175,000 tests per week. And PCR remains the most accurate and internationally recognised gold standard diagnostic test for SARS-CoV-2. Our PCR testing capacity is focused on high-yield target groups in the population, such as symptomatic persons, close contacts of cases, along with high-risk settings and specific indications to limit the importation of COVID-19 as a result of essential travel to the country. In addition, since late March 2021, free walk-in testing pathways have been established to provide access to free PCR testing for asymptomatic individuals in various locations around the country, where there is deemed to be a public health need, for example, due to high disease incidence in a local community. And sure, you'll be well familiar with that in Limerick. In addition to our PCR testing capacity, substantial work has also been undertaken by the HSE to examine the potential role for rapid testing within the wider pandemic response. As part of this work, the HSE has performed independent and site-specific validation in Ireland of a number of rapid antigen tests. On foot of the findings in this work, the HSE recommends the use of rapid antigen tests be considered as a diagnostic test in symptomatic people when a public health risk assessment determines that the rapidity of results is of utility as an adjunct to the available PCR capacity. For example, in vulnerable communities where there is follow-up of those positive results likely to be challenging, or as a supplement to PCR testing in the event of inadequate PCR capacity to meet requirements, a situation we don't find ourselves in at this point in time. International evidence to date, including two recent major international publications from the Infectious Disease Society of America, published on the 5th of June, I think, of this 5th of this month, and the Royal Statistical Society in the United Kingdom also published this month. The recent COVID-19 test validation summary report published by the HSE earlier this week, and existing guidance from the WHO and the ECDC all indicated that rapid antigen tests typically perform best in symptomatic individuals and in settings of high disease prevalence, and less well in asymptomatic persons in low prevalence situations. Based on existing evidence, the use of rapid antigen testing may be considered in high prevalence settings such as outbreaks, where the pre-test probability of individuals being infected is high, and where more rapidly available results may support PCR testing through the early identification of cases and the implementation of appropriate follow-on public health actions. And the HSE has already made antigen tests available for deployment in such scenarios where deemed appropriate by local public health teams. Rapid testing with antigen testing may also be considered in higher risk environments for transmission of COVID-19, as may exist in, for example, meat processing plants. And substantial work has been conducted to evaluate the results and the use of rapid antigen tests in asymptomatic workers in this setting under strictly controlled processes. And both the HSE and Department of Health have supported piloting of rapid antigen testing in meat processing plants led by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. The HSE has also made rapid antigen tests available for use in acute hospital settings if deemed of additional utility by the relevant institutions in the context of access to typically quick turnaround of PCR testing on site. In addition, the Department of Health has supported and does support the development of a collaborative pilot now in place by the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research and Innovation and Science, SFI, the HSE, PICWA and a number of third-level institutions, a validation study to examine the potential applicability of different rapid antigen testing approaches in third-level settings, and we look forward to reviewing the output from that study. Separately, the HSE is also progressing plans to pilot rapid antigen tests for use in childcare settings, as well as in a number of third-level institutions, as I've said. However, while there may be a potential utility to be realised from the use of rapid antigen testing in controlled environments, and this may evolve further over time, there is still much we need to learn about these tests and their actual, as opposed to hypothetical, benefits and limitations. As stressed by the authors of the Royal Statistical Society report in the UK, and I encourage you to read it, The proper assessment of the suitability of COVID-19 tests has been neglected to date, with many tests brought to market without appropriate real-world evaluation or well-designed studies evaluating those tests in real-world settings when they're used, and this must become appropriate standard practice. In particular, while the aforementioned indications and pilots may be considered as red light rapid testing activities, picking up additional cases in a timely manner and appropriately integrated into our wider public health response, significant caution is urged in regard to any move towards employing rapid antigen testing for green lights, or in other words, enabling activities that we would otherwise deem to be unsafe, particularly while not accounting for the prevailing epidemiological situation. Given the limitations of such tests, along with the current lack of a substantive supporting real-world evidence base, the hypothesis that antigen testing could be a precursor or enabler for the safe recommencement of certain activities which would otherwise deemed not to be safe, given the prevailing epidemiological situation, poses several risks both to the individuals engaging in those activities, to those around them, as well as to our wider public health response. As the evidence evolves, and assuming that this evidence is in support of the use of rapid antigen testing, we're more than willing to support its further use where appropriate evaluation indicates that it can bring added benefit in the pandemic response. Ultimately, however, based on knowledge to date, the safest way for us to reopen society, including international travel, will be to continue to control the incidence of the disease, and we're making encouraging progress in that regard through a range of public health measures which are continuously reviewed as we do, along with progressing the national vaccination programme to ensure as many people as possible within the population are protected through immunisation. That is our current policy, and it's working. Once again, we'd like to thank this committee for extending an invitation to meet with you today to discuss the COVID-19 testing strategy in relation to travel, or anything else you may wish to ask us about, and we're happy to take any questions, Chair and members, that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mullen, and we just want to thank RT for broadcasting this live on their RT News channel, and I think it's going to be hugely important engagement for both ourselves and for the public looking in. So what we want to do here really is to have, I suppose, a discussion very much around the science around rapid antigen testing and the proposals we've heard from expert witnesses across the spectrum, people that have advocated antigen testing, and obviously, Dr. Mullen, you appreciate that you're the advisors to government on medical matters in NPHET, so it's critical that we engage and get your views on the matter so we can find a way to progress it. So we'll now move to members. Members, because of the limited time, we have to conclude here by 2:30. It's important that we operate 7 minutes per member. I would like questions to be put to the witnesses concisely and succinctly as possible, to allow time for the questions to come back in the 7 minutes, because we've a large number of members wishing to contribute. So first up for Fianna Fáil is Deputy James O'Connor. You have 7 minutes, Deputy O'Connor.
Thank you, Chairman. And just to confirm, I'm within the confines of Leinster House here at the moment. Look, I want to first and foremost say to Dr. Houlihan, to the members of NPHET, that there's no doubting the fact that some of the measures that we've put in place have saved many, many lives throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it has to be said that the group of you before this committee today, and I appreciate you coming before this committee today, need to have questions put to you, particularly for many people working in the aviation sector that we've all heard here in the committee over the past number of months. It's arguably the case at the moment that NPHET is the most powerful unelected body in the country, and you must be scrutinised by members of this committee and by members of Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann. From my own perspective, I am extremely concerned around Ireland's lackadaisical approach to the area of antigen testing. And I have to say, it's concerning to see Ireland being a laggard in this respect when I'm looking at countries like Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Germany, Denmark, Estonia, Spain, France, Hungary, Italy, and I could go on, that are all actively looking at the area of antigen testing and how it could benefit the area of aviation. We are arguably arriving at a position, Dr. Houlihan, where Ireland will have their vaccination process completed or relatively completed towards the end of the summer and early autumn. Surely be to God, we need to start looking at the implementation of antigen testing. The Ferguson report said it had specific benefits to doing in terms of its implementation. And I know that you've used a couple of phrases here today around its accuracy, but arguably in a controlled environment, like an airport, like an aircraft, where there is security, where there's policing methods, where there's crowd control in place already, surely there is no better place for us to be looking at for the implementation of antigen testing. So specifically on the area of aviation, can I put the first question to you? Why are we not looking at antigen testing? Thank you.
Dr. Houlihan.
So, as I've said already, we are looking at antigen testing. It's been already examined in a number of settings. When we find evidence of the value of it, we apply that evidence. I've set out already in symptomatic situations, in certain high-risk situations. I'm not aware of any published data anywhere that is reported on use in the kinds of sectors or settings that you've described applied to asymptomatic individuals. I'm not aware of it. There's no such data published from any independent studies conducted anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. Maybe you're aware of some, but we're not.
Dr. Houlihan, I just wanted to clarify my question. In the area of aviation, that was my question specifically. In the area of aviation, why in a controlled environment can we not use antigen testing in that specific setting? Thank you.
Of course, we can use antigen testing in any setting, so long as we have validated the use of the testing and we know what a positive result means and what a negative result means. We haven't seen any evidence as yet generated from that sector. We'd be more than willing to support if there was to be any validation study proposed to be carried out in that setting. We have no opposition whatsoever. You quote the Ferguson report, and you quite rightly say that it points out, as it does, the need for us to have well-conducted validation studies supporting policy in this area. That's what we want. If we're going to start using antigen testing in any sector, including the airline sector, we're fully open to that, and we want it to be informed by the outcome of validation studies. If I could point to one example, you may be aware, in the third level sector, there's a very good study getting underway now this summer involving the academic institutions funded through SFI, sponsored by the lead department, Minister Harris's department. That's exactly the kind of validation exercise that we need to inform us as to whether there's a benefit or not. And depending on the findings of that study, that will inform the application of the rapid antigen test in that particular sector. That's exactly how a responsible approach to validation and rolling out of antigen testing should happen.
And Mr. Houlihan, could I not argue, if we're going to be doing this in a university, surely we could be doing this sooner in settings like matches, in music festivals as well. And I just have to say that I don't think our response in terms of our testing capabilities around antigen testing are up to scratch in terms of large-scale events. And we should be increasing capacities at events using the antigen testing systems that are available. One point I just want to make, and I think it's very, very important to say this here, Chairman. You know, there's a 3 to 4 day window in early infection where both antigen and PCR tests can falsely display a negative test. And you know, you have to ask yourself the question, when you're comparing like with like in terms of or trying to compare like with like in the sense of the different systems that are in place for testing with for COVID-19, surely when you say something like that, is that not enough of a reason to look at antigen in the area of aviation? Because we're already using PCR. Because the likelihood is in the 3 to 4 day incubation or early periods where somebody could have contracted COVID-19, there is already a strong likelihood that we're going to miss that. Look, my own position is that there should be antigen tests implemented by the state in every possible location, because if it was in a fuel garage, I'd go in and use it. If it was an airport, we would all use it if we had to, if it was mandatory. And I just think it's ludicrous for the 140,000 people whose livelihoods depend on aviation in this country that we are not looking at this particular mechanism for the area of COVID-19 testing. I think the Ferguson report set it out quite clearly. Professor Mina of Harvard, an assistant professor of epidemiology, says that it is a very powerful tool in tackling COVID-19. So, Professor Houlihan, I want to make a point and I want to ask a question. I think we should be doing more of this. But do you think there is the capacity for this state to up its level of testing events to see how we can actually implement antigen testing, looking at things like electric picnic, looking at the aviation sector? Do you think we have the capacity to do that in the next 6 months?
So the number of questions that you raised are not confined to aviation. I'm going to encourage some of my own colleagues here in the room to continue to come in on some of the individuals will have more expertise on the points that you made in relation to the performance in relative terms of the different testing modalities. And I don't think we'd fully accept your interpretation of that evidence.
Well, I'm simply quoting, assistant professor from Harvard, Dr. Houlihan.
So what we rely upon for anything, whether we're talking about a new drug or a new test, is published evidence in relation to the use in a particular clinical setting. If you read, and I'll just refer you to one, if you read the Royal Statistical Society report, it's a really excellent treatise on the dangers and the risks of applying tests when there isn't good evidence to support the application of those tests, and the standards that need to apply in terms of the conduct of validation studies. It makes many, many points. I'd encourage you to read it. But one of the points that it makes is that if we're going to apply, and here we're talking about antigen tests in the way that you've described, a wide variety of different settings, we need to have that informed by the conduct of well-planned and organised run validation studies applied to each of those sectors, so we know and understand what the impacts of them are. That's a position that the Ferguson report also sets out, and that's our position.
Thank you, Dr. Hoolan. In my final minute, and I just want to ask this question because it's very important. Our government's chief scientific advisor, Professor Ferguson, you know, his report was put together under a project taken by this government. And I want to ask you and NPHET, where specifically in the Ferguson report do you disagree with? Why can we not implement some of the findings of that report?
I haven't expressed any disagreement, have I? You didn't hear me express any disagreement with the Ferguson report.
But in general, I would like to put that question to you. It's not about your opening remarks here, but I think that question has to be asked, because surely if you don't have any disagreements, could we not look at some of the specific findings of that report in terms of implementation?
As I've said, we are fully open to and encouraging of the conduct of well-organised validation studies. This is supported by all the bodies I mentioned in my opening statement. I can go back over them if you wish. Our position is exactly the same. When we have good quality validation studies that support the use and tell us and inform us. So we've had a recent one published by the team led in the HSE by Mary Keoghan, who's here with me, and Lorraine Doherty, that has looked in asymptomatic populations about the performance of antigen tests in comparison to PCR. So where people who have a positive PCR are also tested with antigen, it picks up the disease in 52% of those asymptomatic situations. And that's one validation study that has been conducted in this country. There's another that I've told you about also being planned for application in the third level sector. An exact example of the kind of study as recommended by the Ferguson report, the way for us to go about establishing whether or not there's an evidence base to. What we can't do is simply start rolling out tests on the basis of people think they're a good idea without us supporting that with good quality scientific evidence generated from independent validation studies. Okay. That's our position. I don't think that's at variance with the Ferguson report, and I don't think that's at variance with the position of all the international bodies that I've set out for you.
Thanks,
Dr. Hoolan, thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Could I ask some of my colleagues here who haven't had an opportunity to respond to some of the questions, Chair, if it's not unduly delaying you?
Yeah, we're just, obviously we have to be conscious, Dr. Hoolan, that we have a lot of members, so just I'd ask the responses to be as concise as possible.
Well, if I could say a few words, I will be concise. Validation is a normal part of diagnostics. Every test put into practice needs to be validated. This is not confined to antigen testing, and indeed over the last year, there have been 4 PCR tests which have not met the criteria to be introduced into our hospitals. Had we failed to validate, we would have missed the diagnosis in a number of patients, allowing outbreaks to proceed and denying patients appropriate treatment. So validation is a key part of diagnostics for any test. Internationally, and in all of the countries you mentioned, manufacturers' claims of sensitivity and specificity have not been borne out in many cases by independent field evaluations. In line with the ECDC position, we need to do independent field evaluations to confirm or refute the manufacturer's claims. Most of these antigen tests were developed to investigate symptomatic individuals. The findings in symptomatic individuals cannot be extrapolated to asymptomatic individuals. It is a key part of our public health response that symptomatic individuals should not be going to school or work, to events, or indeed travelling. No test is perfect, and so if symptomatic people continue to go about their business as if they're asymptomatic, that will cause problems. So we are talking about the results here in asymptomatic people. One myth with antigen testing is that they're rapid and easy. To do one test is rapid and easy. To do 100 is extremely labour intensive. So for example, in the Barcelona concert at the end of March, 80 nurses were deployed to work 12-hour days to get the 5,000 people tested. So it is key that members of this committee understand the enormous work involved. Self-testing is promoted as a way to get around this, but these tests are open to manipulation. You can produce a negative test, or you can produce a positive test by using carbonated beverages. So self-testing is not used in any jurisdiction for a test-to-enable approach.
Thanks. We'll move on, and then the other members will come in as we go along, Dr. Hoolan. Can I just take up a couple of points? We're not saying that rapid antigen testing should replace PCR. Quite the reverse. We're saying it should be complementary. So I just have a couple of questions, Dr. Hoolan. The Ferguson report you make reference to, and you're saying you're in agreement with the report. Has the report been discussed at NPHET? That's number one. Number two, we're putting it in the context initially for this committee around aviation and travel. And is it fair to say that if someone takes a PCR test at the moment, 3 days prior to arrival in Ireland, there's no guarantee that they will not have developed at a high viral load and be very infectious when they actually board the plane on the third day. So therefore, when they arrive into Ireland, when they board the plane, they could infect people on the plane. We believe that rapid antigen testing has a role to play pre or post-departure, that it can be done within an hour. And Professor Gogan, I take your point on, we'll say the test for a large number of people. This is for one person, right, going on a plane. And the question I suppose I have in that context, Dr. Hoolan, is, are there any situations to date where someone who travelled into Ireland with a negative PCR test was found within a number of days to be symptomatic and had to go for a test, and that test was a positive PCR test? So the question I'm putting really is, surely rapid antigen testing has a role to play in being part of the toolkit alongside PCR in terms of reducing the risk from COVID in terms of detection. No test is foolproof, including PCR. PCR is the standard, we accept that. It's not foolproof. And your report benchmarked antigen against PCR being the at one. It's not one. It's a great test, and it is the standard. So if you could just deal with that point. The Ferguson report, have you discussed it at NPHET? Secondly, my question, the basic question on the antigen test being done pre-departure. And have you had situations where you've had a passenger coming into Ireland, negative PCR, and then a couple of days later develop symptoms and they get a positive PCR test, which would have shown, and you're required then to go back 48 hours, that all the people on the plane would be deemed to be close contacts, and that effectively, if that person had been tested pre-departure, they would have been COVID positive. Thanks, Dr. Hoolan.
Great, thank you. And I'll look maybe, Chair, with your permission, to some colleagues to come in and supplement some of what I might say. So absolutely, again, don't disagree with the idea that there is potential for antigen testing to work in a complementary way with PCR testing in any setting. We must validate that use. And we don't have validation from the settings that you've described that show some of the things that you've said. We do use PCR. We recommend a test pre-travel and then a test after 5 days. I'll let Dr. Glynn come in on that in a moment. You're right to say it's not a guarantee. There are no guarantees. Even when we find ourselves in a situation where we have people vaccinated, and our position would be, from a European point of view, when we're talking about travel between countries, when people are vaccinated, we won't require evidence of any form of testing in relation to that travel. And that won't be a guarantee that there won't be transmission of infection, because it is still technically possible. These these vaccines do not render people fully immune. We know that. Yes. But we think it risks substantially to allow us to proceed. PCR is the best test that we have. It is what's in the trade known as the gold standard. and it is accepted and standard practice that any other
Dr. Woolen, do you accept
performance terms to the PCR
do you accept that someone could be negative PCR 3 days pre-arrival and actually could be positive when they board a plane, and the rapid antigen test could provide a role in that? And have there been cases where you...
Of course I accept that. But what we have to show is that will that be validated in practice? And we don't have a study that establishes that. Is what you're saying plausible? Of course it's plausible. What then should happen is a scientific hypothesis is developed, a study is put in place to test that hypothesis, and the study is conducted that will answer the question one way or the other.
And Dr. Woolen, on that basis, would you support a pilot scheme for a flight from Ireland to another country to test to see? You would obviously do your PCR test alongside the antigen test for every passenger, but to validate then, so the hypothesis I'm putting forward, which is to ensure that every person that could be potentially have the COVID would be caught going onto the plane.
Insofar as through any of those testings you can ever guarantee that, of course, what you're suggesting is a good idea.
Okay.
And it's got to be the kind of validation study that should be done. But we should then only apply, if you like, our understanding of antigen testing when we have exactly the kind of... That's
fine. If you're agreeable to that, we deem that to be a step forward. Can I just, in the limited time I have, the Delta variant in the UK, and why did you recommend to government that you would extend the test period, the quarantine period in terms of testing for people that are validated? They would still have to have a PCR test within 5 days. And yes, we're looking at under the digital twin certificate to require no test. And for someone that has a negative PCR, that they'll have to not only now get a negative PCR 5 days in, but 10 days in as well. You might just give us your thinking around why you made that recommendation to government.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but I haven't had other colleagues just come in on some of your earlier questions, if that's okay. Chair, I'm asked Professor Nolan.
I think very quickly, the notion that you can be negative in PCR today and positive in 3 days' time isn't news to anybody. If I'm exposed to the virus today, it grows inside me for 3 or 4 days undetectably. So I could be exposed today. I could take a PCR test on Friday and be negative. Then the virus replicates very quickly, so I could be PCR positive on Sunday or Monday. And that's why quite frequently, as you know, 2 tests are recommended because it's to be latent. It's interesting to propose that on top of that 2-test regime, an additional rapid antigen test might pick up some cases that we're missing. It's not particularly plausible. It would mean that you'd have to go from a position of having almost no virus or no virus detectable to having a very large viral load within 24 or 48 hours. So in designing a pilot to check whether that would be a useful addition, you'd have to be very careful about the number of people you include in the pilot. It might have to be a very large study. So I think the fundamental point that we want to make here is, as a country, we need to prioritise. It's difficult to do a pilot. You can't have a scattergun approach and say, let's try this everywhere. So it's important that we prioritise in what settings are we going to pilot the use of antigen testing. Clearly, the settings where it's a priori most likely to be useful. And then we have to very carefully design the validation studies.
Professor Nolan, would you accept aviation is one of those settings? Travel is one that we need to do a pilot on.
As I say, it's an interesting proposal. It'd be for others to think through of all of the things, including government, to think through of all of the things that we might be interested in testing in. What are the optimal ones to test in?
You would support it, yeah. Thank you. Dr. Woolen, in the limited time, do you want, Professor de Gascoigne,
Yeah, Killian.
In relation to the Delta variant, we're obviously, this is an evolving situation from the UK, and we're seeing data coming through regularly on a weekly basis from them. There was concern that initially, when they looked at early data, that the incubation period for Delta might be slightly longer and the period of infectivity might be slightly longer. Now, that hasn't yet been confirmed, but it's something that they're continuing to investigate. Equally, I suppose the later test at day 10 will cover the in-transit period of time from the UK for possible acquisition. Obviously, the majority of cases there are associated with the Delta variant at this point in time. But I think just to come back to, and I won't delay, but come back to the bigger question, I suppose, is what the committee feels that antigen testing is adding to the PCR that's already in place. The PCR is the preferred test. It's a better test. And the standards that have been put in place before antigen tests were ever developed by the WHO and ECDC, the antigen tests that we have don't perform to those standards in the asymptomatic cohort. So I think it will be useful, and it's probably not for today, but to try and get back to what the question is, what problem are we trying to solve? Is PCR too expensive? Is it too labor intensive? Is it can't be inaccessible. We're doing 175,000 tests a week. So I think we need to try and address the fundamental principle, because PCR is a better test. Antigen in the asymptomatic cohort will miss 1 in every 2 cases. And that case that is missed may well be infectious. That case that is missed may well be infected with the Delta variant or indeed any other variant. So I think
sorry,
the public health measures
Dr. Gascoigne, I would dispute that, because, Dr. Gascoigne, that's over a 30-day period. At its most infectious period in
respectfully, Chair, I would disagree. The average length of time for PCR positivity, based on the evidence, is about 17 days, with a range of 15 to 18 days.
Yeah.
So there's an awful lot of opinion that has been offered as fact, and I think that's detrimental.
Sorry, finally, because I other members.
If you look at the HSC report, that's real-world evidence that we have in Ireland.
But in summary, Dr. Gascoigne,
by our colleagues here.
Dr. Gascoigne,
in the world. So we need more pilots in the real world.
Okay, then we'll do. But at their most
and in aviation,
at their most infectious.
That's not. Unfortunately, the evidence isn't there to back that up, Chair. Again, with respect, it's opinion based on a CT value across a population, and unfortunately, a CT value is not.
But you're willing to go with a pilot scheme. That's welcome.
Absolutely, no pun intended.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask Dr. Glynn to address the question around the UK? Because we do have an emerging concern based on the changing epidemiology and the component of transmission attributable to this new Delta variant throughout the UK. None.
Sure. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I suppose just to point out, I suppose the reason for the increasing concern in relation to the Delta variant is that it now accounts for over 90% of cases in the UK, and over the past number of weeks, we've seen a deteriorating situation there, with a 50% increase week on week in the number of cases reported across the UK, with a doubling time in some regions of less than a week, with an increase in hospitalizations 15% week on week over the last couple of weeks. So that all gives us cause for concern. Of course, the ultimate measure is to stop travel. That's the only way you can entirely eliminate risk. The next option is to institute 14 days, so a full quarantine period. And then the next upon that is to decide on a regime which allows release from quarantine based on testing. So the recommended approach now in relation to overseas arrivals from Britain is that they'll have a negative PCR test prior to departure, a not detected test again at day 5 post arrival, and a further not detected test at day 10, and that's obviously for people who are not fully vaccinated arriving overseas from Great Britain.
Thank you. I now move to Sinn Féin slot, Deputy O'Rourke. 7 minutes, Deputy O'Rourke.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm conscious of the fact that Dr. Holohan and the Gascoigne were with us on the 3rd of November last, and at that time we had no testing, PCR or antigen testing, but we had a very similar conversation about the need for validation and the importance of validation and real-world testing. And in the meantime, we've had a number of reports in October and 2 in April from HICWA from the ECDC in November and May, the Ferguson report in April, and more recently from the HSE. And there's been lots of conversation in terms of the comparisons, infectious versus non-infectious, symptomatic versus asymptomatic, serial versus single point in time, self-administered versus laboratory-administered, sensitivity, specificity, different platforms, different testing strategies. Yet we're back at the place where we were last November, saying that there isn't enough evidence there. It begs the question, and I think it's important to say that we have heard very strong and compelling evidence from a range of people, and you'll have heard it yourselves, that they say, who say that antigen testing, and what I'm hearing is serial antigen testing, actually could be an improvement on the regime that we have in place. So that's, I take that as an opportunity. What they're saying is, serial antigen testing could be an improvement on the regime that we have in place. Single point in time, PCR, 72 hours pre-departure, and essentially go about your business if you want after that. I think it has to be recognised the weakness of the current regime and the opportunity potentially that's there of PCR testing. Or of antigen testing. Can I ask the question, why no pilot studies have been taking place in the aviation sector, going back to as far as the 3rd of November? Who makes that decision? Who decided to focus more generally? Who decided to focus on the meat industry? Who decided to focus on the third level sector?
Roland?
Yeah, so maybe just a couple of things if I might say. So the situation back, I think your word for it was the 2nd of November, Killian and I were with you. The situation has changed significantly from then. We now have a very substantial portion of the population vaccinated, and shortly find ourselves in the happy position where we think those people will be able to travel freely without the need for any form of testing. That's a remarkably changed situation in relation to travel and the situation that pertained to when we met you last. Where, frankly, any basis we would have had for expressing optimism about the future of travel was very guarded. We're much less guarded about that now. We're on the cusp of being able to see, with all the appropriate public health measures being applied to both travel and then to people's activities after they travel, people being enabled to travel where they're vaccinated. And that's a really good situation. We will continue to advocate that people who are not yet vaccinated, they would wait, because we're very close to the point where the majority of people in this country who are currently the target of vaccination will be offered their vaccine. So I'd say that's a changed situation. I think you said at the beginning, and maybe it was a mistake, that we have no form of testing in place, and that isn't the case. I mean, PCR testing has been in place since the very early days of this pandemic, and there were many candidates.
But not as part of the protocol for international travel. Not as part that didn't happen on a mandatory basis until this year, 2021.
Most of this part of the world has had recommendations against all non-essential travel for a long-standing period of time, and work has been done around Europe now to put us in a situation where we'll be able to see, with digital green search and a range of other measures in place to support it, the resumption of airline travel, and we're all looking forward to that.
Just the question in relation to who makes the decision. How does one go about establishing a pilot study? Why have we them in the meat industry and that's appropriate and the third level sector, but not in the aviation sector? And bear in mind, this committee wrote to various ministers on the 5th of May recommending that a pilot study be put in place to provide the evidence base that you're calling for.
So I'm going to ask maybe one or two of my colleagues to come in and support what I'll say, but we depend on the sectors themselves to come forward. What you've seen is the meat sector come forward very responsibly in respect of its own staff and put arrangements in place for public health measures of all forms to limit the transmission to their staff, and that has included the use of some of this testing, and we're happy to support the evaluation of all of that. And that has happened because the meat sector themselves have come forward, the Department of Agriculture have come forward. We're similarly seeing that with the Department of Further Education, or Higher Education, I should say, Minister Harris's department, supported by funding from SFI and the third level bodies.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious of time. time. But who takes the lead in relation to that? Because we heard from Dr. Niamh Power last week or the week before, and she specifically outlined how she proactively established the antigen testing process at the airports here. So that strikes me as, you know, the sector putting its hand up and saying we're ready to play a role here. Like, is it the department that takes the lead, the minister?
What I would say to you, Deputy, is that the safe and effective resumption of every part of the sectors of society that have been the subject of restrictions, either social restrictions or economic restrictions, will be those self-same sectors coming forward with their own plans. And they understand our public health advice. It's clear, it's simple, it's straightforward. Applying that in the form of guidance and then having appropriate oversight. And I have to say, the vast majority of society has taken that very responsibility. They take onto themselves both the responsibility and the risks and the management of those in the resumption of those activities. And that's exactly how you've asked about pilot studies in relation to, or the use of antigen testing, serial testing in the form of meat plants, and then planned testing for the third level sector. That's exactly how they've done it. That's the responsible way for it to happen, that the sectors themselves, in seeking to make their activities as safe as they can, apply all of the measures that we recommend, in the plans that they have for resumption. And whether you're talking about pubs, restaurants, whether you're talking about airlines, workplaces of all kinds, that's exactly what's happening. Those plans, if you like, for each of the individual sectors are not being drawn up by NPHET. We don't have knowledge of the pub industry. We don't have knowledge of the school sector in the way that those sectors do themselves. They've developed their own guidance, and in the case of a number of them, developed what I would say is world-class guidance. Take the schools, for example, applying that guidance in such a way to really minimise the risk of transmission in the school environments, which have allowed us.
Just from your experience, the role of the minister and the department, is it transport in this? Like, would it be transport in this case? Would it be health? Would it be another department? You know, there are lots of forums for and I'm sure the sector is looking on here. You know, it's been making this call and published reports as far back as July last year, calling for the implementation of just such testing regimes, because from their perspective, it's about aligning the interests of public health, but also public confidence in whatever aviation, whatever international travel is happening, that it's happening safely. I think that's the objective here.
Yeah, and just to make the point, and I will invite some other colleagues in if that's okay. To make the point, it's one thing to call for the use of a test where the evidence to support that use does not exist, and that's been the case heretofore.
But we could create that evidence, right? Isn't that the case? We could create that evidence by, you know, we could generate that evidence if we, you know, there's lots of experience around your table within the various departments to design a suitable study to control, you know, to compare the performance. And actually now is an opportune time where there is limited travel and there are already, you know, PCR tests in place. It begs the question, why, you know, since the 5th of May, we haven't had such a pilot study. You know, are there other resistances there?
There's certainly no resistance from our point of view to the application and development of properly designed pilot studies to answer the questions that you're raising. Very reasonable questions.
Dr.
We have no issue with that. Can I bring Dr. Glynn here, Chair?
Yeah, I think one of the misperceptions generally is that, you know, we just haven't bothered to do these pilot studies. The reality is many of the studies, or the types of studies you're talking about, haven't been done neither in Ireland or internationally, because it's not as simple as turning up the airport with a couple of thousand antigen tests and handing them out and seeing what they show. A validation study is a set of steps that takes a test, that looks at it. There's a whole range of ethical acceptability concerns, the performance of the test, the logistics of the test. All of that has to be considered as part of the work. And that's why when we sit here and we say we don't have evidence, it's not that we just don't have evidence in Ireland. There isn't evidence internationally because other countries have not been able to do these to the standard that is necessary. So, and just to give an example of that,
Dr. Glenn,
who's done this work in Ireland over the last 6 months, to give a description of the kind of things that have to be thought about when you come to do a pilot study like this.
Dr. Glenn, Dr. Owen, just one thing. Unlike other countries, many other countries are allowing antigen testing. We're not. So if and I would have thought that this report that you produced late Monday evening. That report was commissioned last October. It would have struck me that to look at, that's at this stage nearly 9 months ago, to look at a pilot scheme on aviation would have fitted perfectly in. Take your point, and certainly your caution has served us well. I want to compliment your work, but nevertheless, we need a pilot scheme because to give that level of validation that you're looking for. So if it's brought forward from the Department of Transport or the Department of Health, is it something that you'll very much support now and expedite?
Can I ask Dr. Keoghan, who's one of the chairs of that process that produced that report you just asked about, Chair?
I think it's really important to look at what is involved in validation. It's not simply, as Dr. Glynn says, turning up a couple of thousand antigen tests. We need to think through the planning, ensure that the study is adequately powered for the epidemiology so that we get useful information. There are international guidelines about the size of the cohort you need. Problems in validating in asymptomatic individuals is it's really hard to get the number of positive people that you need. You need to consider the ethical and consent issues. You need to set up the scheme in a safe way that looks after the health and safety of the people doing the tests and the health and safety of the people being tested. You need to have all of the GDPR compliance in terms of ensuring that you get appropriate data and follow-up. And it took a very large team of people to do the work. Reading the report, you may feel it was easy, you may feel it could have been done quicker. Having worked 7 days a week in this since last October, I beg to differ. This has been an enormous amount of work, and I would like to thank all of the participants who allowed themselves to be double swabbed, and the number of scientists, both from the Department of Agriculture and scientists employed by the HSE to do this work, because it was hugely labour intensive.
Thanks.
Sorry, Chair. Just a very last point. Just to make the case that I appreciate and fully appreciate all the work that has gone in and including in that report. I would make the point that if we started earlier, we would be further on the line in terms of, like, we could have started this work as far back as last November if we had made that decision, and we would have a different evidence base. But also to make the case that, we're talking about pure science here, controlled studies, randomized controlled studies. We're in nobody knows better than yourselves the difficult and complex environment we are fighting this virus. In many instances, there wasn't the opportunity, and there hasn't been the opportunity. We have taken very many measures that haven't, undergone the level of scrutiny that we're proposing to apply to antigen testing, and many people might wonder why.
Okay, thanks. I'll move now to...
Chair, just an important, because a couple of points have been made there by the Deputy. Just to correct, we're not talking about RCTs, or randomised control trials. It's real-world evaluation we're talking about. Yeah. So it's not about it's not about randomised control trials, and it's important to understand. And it's also important, I think, that we
no, and that wasn't the point I make. But I do appreciate. No, I understand it's not randomised control trials. I just mean in terms of it's pure science. You're talking about in controlled studies.
I'm not certain that it's been heard that, like, from our point of view, if we can keep transmission down to the levels that we have it at the moment. If Europe remains in the encouraging position that Europe finds itself in, notwithstanding the concern that we have about the variant, and if we get our population as well as the European population up the level of vaccination that we plan to over the course of the coming weeks, we will see extensive resumption of airline travel in the late summer without the need for any form of testing.
Thank you. I'll move now to Senator Timmy Dooley. Fianna Fáil slot. Senator Dooley. 7 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think Dr. Houlihan, well, first of all, to thank you for the presentation. And I think you've given some light at the end of a very long tunnel there when you talk about the capacity for free movement of travel to the greatest extent possible within the next number of months. But just, I want to go back to that pilot study in the first instance. To do it to the standard that you would expect, how long might that take, first of all?
Dr. Houlihan.
I might bring in some more expert colleagues on that specific point.
I mean, Chair, if I may, two things that we need to think about on this. I mean, first of all, it's not that we have no evidence. Before we go into any assessment, we have prior evidence, very significant evidence, that these tests are less useful in the screening of asymptomatic populations. In fact, they're not recommended for such use. So before one goes off and invests in designing pilots to add them to the highly effective regime that we already have, you have to consider how likely is it that you're going to have a positive finding. In terms of how long, it's simply not possible to say until somebody sits down and says, this is the use case in which we're going to validate these tests. But just to give a simple sense along the lines that Professor Keoghan just mentioned, if we go out tomorrow and administer tests to 100,000 people in Ireland, we're likely to find 100 to 200 infections. So you're not testing 100,000. You're testing 100 to 200 people. So doing these pilots is, as Dr. Keoghan said, very challenging, takes time, and you sit down before you embark upon it. And is there a likelihood that it's going to?
Would you comment then? Yeah, no, I take that point. Would you comment then on your view on how other countries, particularly in Europe, seem to be satisfied with antigen testing? We had a representative from one of the airports in Rome who had conducted a bilateral arrangement with the United States where they saw the free movement of passengers on that particular route based on antigen testing. Are you familiar with that report, or have you had any look at it?
I mean, lots of individuals and organisations do lots of things. As the Royal Statistical Society has pointed out, few of them are well designed. Some of them are publicly commissioned, some of them are privately commissioned. But I think Dr. Gaskin or Dr. Keoghan or others will be better placed to comment on international practice.
Deputy Dooley, but maybe Dr. Keoghan might be able to come in on this.
I think one of the things that you need to consider is in Ireland, we built up our PCR capacity very quickly to a high level. A number of other countries are extremely challenged in their PCR capacity, and therefore, in the absence of being able to offer PCR, are using antigen tests where they really would like to have a PCR. So the fact that somebody is using them doesn't mean it is their preferred option. To be honest, if I take the data, I think one of the huge misconceptions is that if you're antigen negative, you're not infectious. Our data from the meat plant validation shows that while overall you 52% the sensitivity, of those people you miss, almost over half of them have PCR positivity at a level that would correlate with infectiousness and being a risk. So it is not correct to say that if you're antigen negative, you're not infectious. And in fact, having waded through all this data, some extremely strongly positive people who would almost certainly be culture positive have come up negative on antigen tests. To be honest, if we were starting a validation in the aviation, I doubt we'd improve on available PCR capacity, and we have abundant PCR capacity. But in the same way as when clinical services come to me and ask about using point of care testing, I'm often looking at point of care molecular testing, which will give a much better outcome rather than antigen testing. And I think we've become too polarized and too focused on antigen testing. As Dr. de Gascon said earlier, we really need to be clear, what is the question we're asking? Because good diagnostics involves getting the best available test to answer the question that has been asked. Tests don't exist in a vacuum, or tests don't have a role in a vacuum. We've got to define what is the question, what do we want to achieve, how do we best achieve that, and then look at a validation study of the best and most likely to work solution.
And I certainly agree wholeheartedly with what you say, but I think the question surely has changed significantly in the last 6 months if you work on the basis of a risk analysis and you look at the level of vaccination, the very significant reduction in death or hospitalisation, surely the question is now, within reason, how do we get people back travelling as safe as possible, recognising that there will still be the potential for some spread, but recognising that the potential for death or hospitalisation is greatly reduced? How, on a wider level, can we support an industry that has such a significant impact on our economy? And how do we get some level of normality back into that sector? That, to me, is the question. It's perhaps not a question for yourselves, it's a wider governmental issue, but you obviously have a significant input into it. And then maybe just, I'll let you come back on that, but just one other question. You talked, Dr. Houlihan, about the level of vaccination and how well it's working. Well done to everybody for that. What then is the justification for restricting those that are fully vaccinated from international travel, particularly within Europe, until the 19th of July, when there are people today who are fully vaccinated, could start travelling again? There are airlines that have opened up routes. What's the justification for the delay from your perspective, or is there one?
So, I mean, you rightly say, I mean, at the moment, like the two things we're doing our best to control transmission through the public health measures. And at the moment, incidence is actually falling in the last couple of weeks in this country. We've seen encouraging moves in that direction, even though we're watching this Indian variant and what's happening in the UK and now in Northern Ireland very, very closely. We're getting more and more people vaccinated. Those are the things that will allow us to have safe resumption of airline travel and to have people flying again without the need for us to be putting hurdles such as testing, where we don't believe that testing will add anything in their way. So we think that when we have incidence in a good place and vaccination in a good place, as it were, incidence low, vaccination high, we can have safe resumption without the need or recourse to testing. It might be worth us just working through a worked example at the current prevalence rate in this country.
Dr. Houlihan, we've
no on that. What I will say, just in relation to that the government made the decision about the resumption of airline travel as from the 19th of July, and reflecting on all of the different matters that the government had to give consideration to, including all the arrangements that have to now be put on train to enable that in terms of certification.
So just sorry to interrupt you there, Dr. Houlihan, for a second before you conclude.
Senator Dooley, you'll have to conclude.
So are you saying the 19th of July is more an operational matter than a response based on the risk?
I'm saying that the government made that decision, that resumption would be from the 19th of July. And we think... That's not
the recommendation necessarily from NPHET.
We think that the arrangements that will apply from then, with the certification that will support them, will allow people who are vaccinated and people who have had the disease and have PCR evidence of having had the disease now within the last 9 months, which will be a lot of people, being enabled to travel safely. They'll have to think about where they're going. They'll have to think about how to minimise the risk while they're travelling. They'll have to think about how to, if you like, comply with the appropriate public health guidance in the places they're travelling to. These are all the standard precautions that we will continue to advise. Yeah. But yes, we're looking forward to the resumption of that travel from then, without the recourse or the need for any form of testing.
Dr. Houlihan, I'm sorry there, Dr. Houlihan. I have other members. Dr. Houlihan, can you hear me? I'm very members. I have a large number of members looking to come in, so maybe members might take up the questions and your colleagues could answer them then. So I'll just move to Deputy Joe Carey. Deputy Carey, 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and thanks very much to Dr. Houlihan and his team for coming before our committee today. We've had a number of hearings in relation to this specific issue. We've heard compelling evidence from a wide range of witnesses that all have recommended we use antigen in restoring our international travel. The impact of not using antigen has been hard felt in this country in terms of aviation, and there will be more damage done to that critical industry in our country if we don't embrace antigen in full. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Houlihan, what's the formal position of NPHET as regards antigen and its use? It is, there is no doubt about it. other countries are embracing the use of antigen in full. They have had their pilots, they're rolling them out. They've learned from them, and they're using antigen in international travel and across society, opening up cultural events. It's widespread. Yet we have our heads in the sand for the last number of months on this, and we don't have a coherent position. I welcome the fact that you've said that, it would be a good idea to have a pilot in relation to international travel. But obviously the state and NPHET, as advising the state, needs to be really behind that and step up and give timelines, outline when this pilot will happen, where it will happen, and how it will happen. We've had, this is our third hearing on this particular issue. We raised these matters last year in relation to antigen, and we all want to move forward. We all want to get back to a realm of normality, and international travel is a key part of that on this island.
Deputy, just to come back on that, and we accept that, and we're on the point of a widespread resumption of that if things stay where they're currently at in Europe in a few weeks' time, to find ourselves in a situation where we'll see a significant range of travel being available to people, as I've said, and I don't want to be wasting your time repeating what I've said about vaccination and all of that, and people who've had evidence of recovery from the disease. We don't have a dependence in relation to PCR or antigen testing to enable that. And I'm not entirely clear where you think the use of antigen testing and what's happened in the last number of months would have changed things for the airline industry in this country or for travel in this country relative to other countries in Europe. I wasn't clear on that from your question. I mean, the position around Europe has been a fairly homogenous one in terms of the risks attending to travel. What's changing that now is that Europe is getting into a better position epidemiologically with the disease as a result of the control measures, for the most part, that are in place, the economic and social restrictions that Europe has had in place. We have had a range of arrangements in place in this country, of course, which are being eased in an evidence-based way as they are across Europe. The position we find ourselves in, we have, in European terms, the 5th lowest cases in the course of this pandemic in this country, the 6th lowest number of deaths, and we count cases and deaths more comprehensively than any other country. That's been the effect of the measures that we've had in place in this country. Travel has been restricted right across Europe and not selectively in this country, and it's not entirely clear to me where you're, if I'm picking it up correctly, your sense that if we had done something differently on antigen testing, in spite of the fact that we don't have evidence to support what you're saying, it would have changed things in terms of people's ability to travel over the course of the last number of months. I might ask other colleagues. No?
I think just in relation, I think you asked the question what our position is in relation to antigen testing. And I think to one of the earlier deputies, it's very important that we understand at any point in this conversation exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about repeated serial testing? Are we talking about one-off testing? Are we talking about testing before events? Are we talking about symptomatic people versus asymptomatic people? And another way to look at it is, in what settings are they appropriate? So for many, many months now, we have said that they can be used in red light settings, so to pick up extra cases in outbreaks. Antigen tests have been available in this country for many months for that purpose, led by public health specialists around the country where they deem it appropriate. The second is in high-risk settings where you want to maybe do serial testing, such as, for example, as we're doing in the meat processing facilities. Again, that's been in place and been looked at on an ongoing basis over many months now. But the third then is in relation to green light, and specifically in relation to asymptomatic people going into events, various other settings where people don't know they have the disease. And I think it's just worth, rather than taking our word for it, look at what the Infectious Diseases Society of America has said in the last few weeks about this. And it's very simple. It's one line. It simply says, for asymptomatic individuals at risk for exposure to SARS-CoV-2, a rapid PCR or laboratory-based test should be used rather than a single rapid antigen test. That's the current position of the Infectious Diseases Society of America. It's backed up by the Royal Statistical Society's report in the UK, It's backed up by ECDC, by WHO. So it's not just us saying it. You know, we have to be led by the evidence. And I might bring in Professor Cormack and Professor Keoghan in relation to that, because ultimately, if we move away from speaking about the evidence, then all we're doing is seeing who speaks better. It's eminence over evidence. It's opinion over fact. And so I think at all times we have to be very careful that as we go through this, that we have to be led by what the evidence is telling us, as opposed to what we want to be true.
Right. Just make a couple of points, Chairman, and I'll try to be brief. But the first thing is that I think it's really important from infection prevention and control point of view, which is my brief, to be very clear that no testing replaces the key message is that if you have symptoms, you should be self-isolating. And there's no test that's going to substitute for that message. I think we all know it, but it needs to be repeated. I think the second thing is, as colleagues have said, it's not about antigen testing versus PCR testing. It's about what is the problem you're trying to solve and which test is fast enough, reliable enough, and cost-effective enough to be deployed in the setting. Nobody being for antigen testing or being against antigen testing, it's like being for or against Phillips screwdriver. You choose the screwdriver for the job that you want to do, and nobody is for or against antigen testing. It's about the specific tool for the job that you want to do, and is the evidence there that just say on the airport side, I think in particular, just to say that you're looking at essentially filtering the flow of people. PCR is the best available filter that we have. Antigen testing, we can see from the evidence, will filter out less of the people who are carrying the virus than PCR will. And you can make a policy decision, and some countries may have made a policy decision to use the filter, which is bigger pore sizes, and some countries may use the smaller one, but that's a policy decision. But what we need to be very clear on is that the pore size in the PCR filter is smaller and it's a better filter, and the pore size in the antigen test is a bigger pore size and it's a less effective filter. So you can choose which filter you want, but it's really important from the scientific point of view to be clear on what you're choosing, what the differences are, and how effective each of those two filters are if you choose to use them. And right now, we don't have the evidence about how effective that filter with the bigger pore size is.
Thanks, Professor Cormack. But equally, Professor Cormack, you may have actually application for two different types of screwdrivers who both do different elements of work. So
you do, and we do use the two different types of screwdriver. It's just which is the best one for the particular job.
Absolutely. Can I just move now to Deputy O'Murrough? 7 minutes, Deputy O'Murrough.
Garamaiga Cahirlock, and I'd like to thank Dr. Holohan and the rest of the NPHET team in relation to coming in here today. Look, I don't want to go back over the ground that's been done. Just to sum up, obviously, similar to what Deputy O'Rourke said earlier, if we had started this earlier as regards putting together obviously a pilot scheme, we would then be in a different place where we'd have the evidence to assess, particularly as regards aviation. Now, from what you've said, what you're saying is the aviation sector would have a responsibility. Obviously, they would state that they have done some elements of work in relation to this, but beyond that obviously government would need to take a lead, no more than they're taking a lead in relation to antigen testing in third level. And I suppose, as was presented to us, was the idea that serial testing of antigen, particularly in real time, sometimes is a better test around transmissibility at that point in time, and I suppose that would have to be built into it. But look, I'm certainly not going to get into the ins and outs of the parameters of a test, but I assume we would need those sectors basically to step up as quickly as possible and to ensure that gets done. Beyond that, what I'm hearing from you is that literally what you're talking about as regards the safe opening, and everybody accepts the necessity of connectivity in this across this island and in this state, as regards aviation, is from a point of view of literally the rollout of vaccinations. And in relation to that, I would also just if you could get any other indicators of anything else that can be done in relation to us ensuring we have basically the opening up of the aviation sector and that it is as safe as possible and gives people obviously gives them the ease to travel. And that they're rest assured that it can be done in a safe way. Also, if I could have a question, if I could put a question, I assume it would be to Professor Nolan in relation to, have we game planned or road mapped out the timeline in relation to the Delta variant, and when we would see that as we open up here becoming taking a lead as I suppose as the main virus, and then I suppose it's a battle of time in relation to the Delta variant versus the vaccine rollout. So if I could get answers in relation to that.
I'll bring Professor Nolan. I think you answered your own question there at the very end. Exactly. It is about time, and it's about buying ourselves as much time in the face of an organism that's likely to become dominant in many parts of Europe if things continue as they are in the UK, to get us protected as much as possible through vaccination. Philip?
Very briefly, I mean, yes, safety is about vaccination. It's also about detecting before you potentially import them, as many potentially importable cases as possible, and missing a percentage of imported cases becomes critically important if within that percentage you're introducing new variants. And you put your finger on the fundamental reason why we're concerned in the safe reopening of travel to detect every possible case that might be coming into the country, not just a percentage of cases. And then to answer your second question about modelling, what happens, how quickly a more transmissible variant becomes dominant depends upon its transmission advantage. And we're not entirely sure what this is yet. But in the context of us having 200 to 300 new cases a day, it also depends, sadly, on how many cases we're likely to import. So it's the number of imported new variants plus the rate at which it transmits within the population. And frankly, you can get a very wide range of answers when you plug that into different models. So models are not entirely useful in this context because the assumptions are so broad, but they point us to one thing: the vital role of surveillance at point of entry and rapid public health intervention at the point of outbreak. These are the two things we know are critically important.
If I might just add and bring in Professor de Gascon, if that's okay. I mean, if we have an emerging sort of concern about a confluence of different issues, and we do, it is around some of the things that you've mentioned there, Deputy Merkel, that if we have unvaccinated people travelling, and if they're also then travelling to places where they're mingling with unvaccinated people from other parts of Europe, for example, over the course of the coming weeks as we open up airline travel, and they're not following the advice to avoid travel, and then coming back to this country, having perhaps come from areas with higher incidence or come from areas that have genuine problems with variants of concern. And some parts of Europe aren't testing as readily as we are for some of that and don't know the extent of the problems they may have with variants of concern. If they come back to this country and then we find ourselves in a situation where, for our own transmission reasons, we've been able to open up things like indoor hospitality, and there is that opportunity for people, and we've seen mingling of people indoors in this country who have been travelling, who were unvaccinated, who have been exposed to variants. That's the kind of thing that could threaten the continued progress that we're making, and in particular could be a risk to some of the congregation that would be necessary to resume normal or near normal, for example, third level education in the autumn time. So like, if we have an emerging, we saw at the beginning of this year, the confluence of a number of different factors are opening up the change in behaviour, the timing of the year, the emergence of the, at the time, B117 variant. But there is a concern that we have about a confluence of factors now, a new variant, international travel for people who are unvaccinated, and the mingling with people abroad, and then coming back into this country and taking advantage of the social opportunities that might be offered if we're opening up indoor dining and so on in July. That is genuine emerging concern from our. So anything the committee can do to help in terms of promoting that message would be very welcome, Chair. Killian, can I?
Thanks, Dr. Hoolan. Deputy, I just wanted to highlight one thing. There's been a couple of suggestions, I suppose, that we could have moved in this space earlier. And I suppose, firstly, I want to acknowledge the work of the Aviation Centre, because I know that they've been having meetings since probably this time last year in this space, because I was involved in a couple of those meetings. But obviously, as the pandemic evolved, we had to prioritise. So the first priority was to build up our testing capacity on island for symptomatic individuals. Then our priority was the residential care facilities and nursing homes. We had the meat processing plants. We had our hospital outbreaks. So all the time, our testing strategy has had to evolve and prioritise the most important areas of need. It's not that aviation wasn't important. It was just that given the restrictions on travel, not only from Ireland, but also from many other countries into Ireland because of our own epidemiological situation at a point in time, it was difficult to do the pilots in those sectors. As Professor Keoghan has alluded to, it takes an awful long time to put in place the right pilot project to answer the question that you're trying to ask. And as I said, it's not that the aviation sector hasn't been willing to do this. It's just been very challenging given the fact that there's been restriction on travel and given the fact that the priorities have shifted over time through no fault of their own. I suppose the second point I just want to address is the future out of this, as Dr. Houlihan has said, is through vaccination and, in general sense, immunity. We need the population to be protected, and vaccination is the best way of getting towards that direction. We probably have 10 to 15% of the population that's been infected over the course of the pandemic, so they will have natural immunity. But as this virus becomes endemic, the way we're all protected is through immunity of some shape or form. Obviously, we want to use vaccination for that so that people don't get disease and don't end up in hospital and don't end up with long-term morbidity. But ultimately, vaccination is the way through this. And we want to normalise this virus over the coming 6 months. We want it to become along the lines of influenza. They're obviously different viruses, but we want to move towards that approach where you will be tested because you're sick, because you're going into hospital, or because you're part of an outbreak, or because you're in another different setting. We don't want to medicalise normal life. We want people to get back to travel. They'll still have to follow the public health guidelines. They'll still have to be careful because other countries won't be in the same situation. We're in a,
all right.
Thanks for that.
Chair, I'm not going. This is coming down to obviously vaccination and immunity. But if there was to be a pilot just in relation to antigen proposed by a government minister working alongside aviation, I assume NPHET would be in support of this.
Yeah, I think you said you're already in support, Dr. Houlihan.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
In principle, we don't have any difficulty with the idea of sectors studying the potential value of antigen testing or anything else in their own sectors. We've been neither a break on that nor advising against that. In fact, our position has been for the use of these tests, as with any other thing, we want that to be supported by well-constructed, designed validation studies. And some sectors have already come forward with that.
Dr. Houlihan, I have quite a number of people, so maybe you might come in. We'll say there'll be follow-on questions from members, but I've quite a number and we're restricted on time. So I'll move now to Deputy Michael Lowry. You have 7 minutes, Deputy Lowry.
First of all, Chairman, I'd like to welcome the NPHET team to our meeting today and thank them for their presentation. And to say on this subject of antigen testing, I've raised this on numerous occasions. I've raised it with the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and various ministers. And I can say that we have political consensus that antigen testing should be used. What we have then, of course, is we have professors disagreeing amongst themselves. We've heard evidence from Professor Mina, Professor Ferguson, and from many other professionals. And then we hear today a counter-argument by the professors around the table at NPHET. But I think, first of all, I want to use my couple of minutes to make a few statements of fact on behalf of the people who are most impacted by this dithering on antigen and whether it should be used or not. It's a fact that following the advice of NPHET, the government imposed serious and severe and prolonged restrictions on international travel. And as a result of that, the aviation sector has absolutely been crippled. And the consequences for many thousands of people who depend on the sector for a livelihood has been absolutely devastating. And the hopes, the dreams and the aspirations of workers has been shattered in that sector. Their lives are in turmoil. They despair about their future and their ability to survive. Now, those workers across aviation are stricken with deep fear and anxiety, and they feel that the ability to control their own future has been snatched from them by NPHET and government policy. And they feel that their financial security and their well-being has been sacrificed to NPHET decisions. There has been this has been for the last year and a half a traumatic and upsetting time for everybody in this country, but no one has paid a higher price than the aviation workers. And they are outraged. We have been listening to them, and I think it's important to convey that message today. They are outraged that NPHET has stubbornly objected to the use of antigen testing. They look on in dismay while you and NPHET dismiss the use of antigen testing. And they cannot understand your logic and rationale. And they ask us to put it to you, why do you steadfastly contradict international experts? And why do you defy the European Commission, who said that we should be using antigen testing? Why are we so different in Ireland? Why is your advice so different to other countries all across Europe who are using antigen testing? Are you saying that they're not making this decision based on evidence or based on validation? Are you actually saying that they're irresponsible in using antigen testing in all of these other countries? Like, why are we so different? And that's what the people, that's what the public are asking out there. So that question is the central question I have. Why are experts in so many other jurisdictions encouraging governments to embrace and utilise antigen testing to control the spread of the virus? And why is there so much advice, is our advice so much at odds with that advice? That's the contradiction, and that's what I need to understand today. Are we saying that all of these other countries are wrong and that we're correct? So if we're saying that, I need to hear the justification for it, because I see no logic or justification in your decision not to endorse the rollout of antigen testing. You mentioned earlier about other sectors. The fact is that the construction industry, the meat industry, who were riddled with outbreaks at the outset of it, they got impatient. They were frustrated with no direct advice from NPHET in relation to how to control it. And they themselves brought in antigen testing, and they had done so very successfully. So they moved themselves, they moved ahead of NPHET and made their own decision in relation to using antigen, and they have done so very effectively. So I think this is an important aspect of it. So, and the final question I would ask here is, we've had this discussion going on about antigen testing for nearly 12 months now, and it has been raised on numerous occasions at a Oireachtas level. And as I said, we have a consensus in relation to it. I want to ask the question, has the members of NPHET made any attempt to engage with the various professionals who are promoting antigen testing? Because the message we're getting back is that the door is closed and that there is no engagement. So if we're going to talk about a pilot project at this late stage, what efforts are you going to make to reach out to those who have expertise in this area? Thank you.
Dr. Holohan.
I'm going to bring in some colleagues on this. There are a number of assertions there that I just wouldn't accept in what Deputy Lowry's saying in terms of our motivation and our position, our advice. And our position on antigen testing is not as articulated by you. Our position in relation to antigen testing is that they are used in situations where it's supported by the evidence. We've outlined already on a number of occasions this morning and this afternoon circumstances in which their use is endorsed by us and made available in symptomatic situations, in high-risk situations. I'll ask Dr. Glynn or maybe Dr. Keoghan to come back on the meat processing examples and in a moment. Many other countries use antigen testing in a variety of different settings and for different purposes. You've heard Professor Keoghan earlier on also saying that, for example, it can relate to the relative availability of PCR capacity. We've been in the fortunate position, we built up PCR testing capacity to a very, very high level, well in excess right now of what our current demand for PCR testing is. So we have a better test and it's available. That's why we use it. Many other countries are not in that happy position. And as I said, in terms of the relative position, and I've outlined it earlier on, we have seen in relative terms the incidence of this infection in this country as being one of the better in Europe, and the impact of that in terms of numbers of deaths. So when you ask the question about NPHET and our position in relation to testing and the impact of NPHET's advice on the airline industry, what you didn't mention was the virus. It's COVID that has created that impact. And the measures that are in place in relation to restriction of airline travel are impacting airline travel all over the world. And it's because, quite simply, when this infection began, we had no natural immunity as a global population. We had no vaccines, obviously, and we had no drugs to treat this disease. And all we had available to us was the relatively crude means of keeping people apart from each other for long enough to stop the transmission of that infection. And unfortunately, at a global level, that had a big impact on many, many activities. And one of those clearly was the airline industry. It simply isn't the case to say that we, in some selective way in this country, through advice from NPHET, selectively impacted the airline industry on a basis that wasn't proportional to our concern in relation to the transmission of this infection. We followed, for the most part, international guidance coming from the international bodies and measures that were in step with measures happening around the world, but in particular in this part of the world, because what we have to bear in mind that the spread of this infection through successive waves has seen Europe in the path of each of those waves over the course of the last 15 months. We've been at the epicenter of this since the get-go, and that has had a big impact on a relatively small country that has such open relations with the rest of Europe. And that's the reason that we've had that impact. It's the virus. It's not recommended. Our recommendations are based on interrupting transmission with that virus. Our evidence tells us that we've done a good job in this country through the efforts that ordinary people have made to comply with that public health guidance. That is what's, in relative terms, given protection around incidents and protection.
Deputy Lowry, you're brief just to come back in, Deputy Lowry.
Can I bring in relation to the meat and others, because you talked about antigen testing in a global sense without recognising that antigen testing applied to symptomatic, to serial, to one-off, whether it's symptomatic or asymptomatic, is entirely different. And we have a different view in relation to it in each of those settings.
Just very briefly, because I have quite a number of other members to come in, Dr. Keoghan. Very briefly.
Very briefly, if I can just say, firstly, that in order to do a validation study in a sector, I left out in my previous remarks, the sector has to be functioning. Yeah. So when we can't do a validation while international travel is shut down. We can learn a lot from the meat plants because the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine worked very closely with the steering group, and we designed the study collaboratively, and we designed it in a way that it would bring key learnings for the meat processing plant and also information that would be of interest to other sectors. And I'd like to acknowledge the role of Donald Salmon, who's a member of the group, who played an enormous role. The Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine actually recruited a lot of their scientists to support the validation study. And there's no way we could have succeeded in testing over 5,000 individuals in parallel with the PCR in the meat plants without that support from the sector.
Thanks, Dr. Keoghan.
Chairman, could I just ask
briefly, very briefly?
One brief question. Could you explain to me how can other European Union countries and how can the European Commission approve the use of antigen testing? Are you saying that they're doing it without validation?
For the travel cert, there is an option and member states choose whether to recognise PCR or antigen or both. Many countries haven't yet declared whether they will accept antigen testing. And there is...
But 17 in Europe have already declared that they will accept it. Why are we so different?
Well, there are a number of discussions going on at European level. I am involved in the technical working group looking at antigen tests. And there are people who, there are countries that have done, who have less access to PCR than we have, or have other pressures. We do have the advantage of being in an island where we can control travel a little bit more. We have the advantage of having more than adequate PCR capacity. We're in a race between the variants and vaccination. And so, as Professor Nolan alluded to earlier, we don't want to start importing cases when we have an option of using a better test.
To move on, I'm afraid. Deputy Matthews, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for...
Just supplementarily.
The decisions that are made in different countries, again, I would just go back to that filter analogy. Some countries may have chosen to use a filter with a bigger pore size or smaller pore size, and we know that the antigen testing will let more infectious people through than the PCR testing will let people through. So people make policy decisions about which filter they're going to use. We're using the higher grade filter. Some countries may choose to use a lower grade filter. It's a question of which filter you choose to use.
I'll have to move to, I've quite a number of members who want to come in. Deputy Matthews, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for their appearance here today. And I also want to thank them for the expertise and commitment they've shown over the last 14 months to the country, and the guidance and the advice that they've given, which has undoubtedly saved lives. And just to comment on the vaccine rollout and the walk-in testing and the PCR test that's been in existence, which has been really well done, and just compliment the team on their actions on that. It's important that we take the advice of experts, especially experts who have responsibility here at home. And it's important that we also try to represent our constituents in protecting their health, but also to protect their livelihoods. And that's what we're trying to do here, take the expert advice and to see how that can be applied so that we can have that successful outcome for the public. So I have 3 questions, and I'll try and keep them to 3 2-minute questions if possible. In every piece of test equipment or process, there are always cheap varieties that may not be accurate and may not be reliable, and you can go to much more expensive, highly reliable and highly accurate pieces of equipment and test processes. Would you have concern that with a rapid rollout or a large-scale rollout of antigen testing, that we would have difficulty in maintaining standards and procedures and management and compliance monitoring of that kind of testing? Dr. Houlihan.
I might come to Professor Gaskin and Professor Keoghan.
Question. Try and confine it to 2 minutes because the member has 2 other questions, and we have to get it done in 7 minutes.
Best, yeah.
It's extremely important, as you say, that any testing is rolled out in the context of a quality management system, where there is checking of each batch that comes in, checking of batches of antigen tests against variants to ensure that their performance isn't compromised, membership of external quality assurance schemes, etc. We do have very detailed near-patient testing guidelines, which should be applied in any setting where these tests are considered for use.
Thank you, Dr. Keoghan. A second question is on the logistics of rolling out antigen testing. We had experts in last week who talked about Croke Park being a possibility with 80,000 people in it in September with the use of antigen testing. Now, we heard reference earlier on, I think it was from Dr. Keoghan, to say a 5,000 person event took 12 shifts of 12 people over 12-hour shifts to try and apply antigen testing. So logistically, the issues that you need to consider with hundreds of thousands of people going through an airport, or 70 or 80,000 people going to Croke Park or Electric Picnic, what can go wrong in those situations, and if it's not controlled properly?
So for the Barcelona concert at the end of March, there were 5,000 attendees, and it was 80 nurses working a 12-hour shift to get those 5,000 people tested. So this is massively labour intensive. It's very manual. Each test takes 15 to 20 minutes to perform. There generally isn't space to have people sit there and wait for their results. So normally in most settings, people come in, are swabbed, you need all the record keeping, etc. And then people receive their result by text. So it is a massive logistical undertaking to antigen test a large number of people.
I suspected as such that it's not as simple as just carrying out an antigen test on one person. I've heard you reference it to say, yeah, it's easy on one person. When you start increasing numbers, it becomes more and more difficult. That might create a situation where we might have slippage in standards or slippage in how we manage that, and you can understand how that might happen. So in terms of those overall numbers then as well, How could we I've heard you say that antigen testing does have a role and can have a role, especially in those controlled situations such as the universities. How could we best use it to complement PCR testing in terms of aviation and in terms of trying to assist those people who have all lost their jobs or can't work at the moment in aviation? Is there a role for it there?
Dr. Holohan?
Could I ask Professor Null just to come through on the example? First of all, I want to address that question.
I think to answer the question the other way around, I mean, I think a lot of the things that people are thinking about are serial testing in particular settings in order to pick up an outbreak early and then move in and manage that outbreak. It's an utterly different kind of circumstance to the one-off test that we're talking about. But just as an example, I mean, if you gathered 60,000 people together, there's another problem with this one-off testing. Gather 60,000 people in Croke Park for sake of example, at a higher prevalence than we have. We'd expect by September prevalence would be lower. So let's say 150 per 100,000. A test sensitivity of 70%, which is generous to antigen testing, and a specificity of 99.8%. You'd expect about 90 infections in that crowd. So maybe your test would pick up 40 of them. It would miss about 20. It would also generate about 120 false positives. If the specificity is worse, there would be more of those. And the first thing to mention is, of those 90 people, perhaps 40, 50 of them would be symptomatic. They shouldn't even be considering going to the event. They shouldn't be going for antigen testing. They should be phoning their GP and seeking a PCR test. So we're now down to 45 asymptomatic people who, in that 60,000 people that we're considering deploying all of those staff to rapid antigen test, we've got 45 asymptomatic infections. We might detect 1 in 2 of those with a rapid antigen test. So we'll find 23 cases. We'll let 22 or 23 potentially infectious people, maybe not as infectious as the symptomatic, but potentially infectious people into the event. And we'll also have 120 other people. So we'll get 5 false positives for every case we're detecting. Not a big thing.
Sorry, I'm just out of time on that. And just to follow up on that then, so not only is it about the testing, it's about the follow-up then afterwards when those results of those tests become apparent, and then that contact tracing that needs to go on after that as well. So there's the before, during and after has to be concerned. We have to
think about the resource and the opportunity cost of doing these things when we perhaps should be focusing on other ways of managing this pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Matthews, for your management of time. Deputy Smith, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank the witnesses for their attendance today. We certainly have a full court press, and I think it's been an interesting meeting so far. It's been, I suppose, a bit competitive. I don't think it's needed to be, but we are where we are. Could I just ask, the Department of Health is supporting the development of a collaborative project by the Department of Further and Higher Education and Research in relation to a pilot programme on antigen testing. Has a similar request or any request in relation to antigen testing been made by the Minister of Transport to the Department of Health? Yes or no?
I'm aware of no.
No. Has any request been made by the junior minister in the Department of Transport for such a scheme?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. All right, so no request has been made by the Minister for Transport that we are aware of to the Department of Health for a scheme. Okay, so that's on them, and we'll take that up with them. In relation to Professor Mark Ferguson and his report, as Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government, what level of engagement does he have with the Chief Medical Officer or indeed NPHET? Is there a regular ongoing engagement or is it sporadic or is there no engagement at all?
He's a member of NPHET.
He's a member of NPHET, okay. So was his report discussed officially by the committee?
I might ask Dr. Glynn to come in on that, because just for personal reasons, I wasn't around during the time that report was compiled and finalised. It was compiled by a group put together by the Minister at the time and reported directly to the Minister. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah.
As to whether there was discussion of NPHET, I wasn't in the chair just for personal reasons at that time.
Oh, I understand. I'm happy to hear from Dr. Glynn.
Yeah, no, as an independent report, it was submitted to the Minister and published by the Minister. Obviously, the issue of antigen testing has come up from time to time, but again, it comes back to the earlier issue in relation to this, that at various times we would have discussed symptomatic versus asymptomatic serial testing, for example, in meat processing facilities versus one-off testing. So to discuss all aspects of it would be a different conversation. But of course, various elements of antigen testing have come up at various times through NPHET.
Okay, so the minister, sorry, Dr. Glynn, so the minister didn't refer it for a specific discussion by NPHET, even though it was a 50-page plus report on an issue that was gaining an awful lot of coverage and was compiled by the chief scientific advisor to the government, who also sits on NPHET. It wasn't advised by the minister to discuss it officially, no.
No, but in much the same way that the minister wouldn't typically advise NPHET to discuss a whole range of different issues. Obviously, the report was assessed within the department and advice was provided to the minister on the report.
Okay. Could I just ask we Professor Mary Horgan from the President of the Royal College of Physicians on Morning Ireland this morning, who was quite strong in support of the use of antigen testing as an additional tool and not a substitution or replacement for any other testing methods like PCR testing. Again, we're quoting again another professor, an eminent professor in a senior position. And again, we as a committee, I think we need to be respected for our work in responding to the comments and contributions from people of these positions throughout the country. But what would your response be to Professor Mary Horgan's widely covered remarks this morning on Morning Ireland?
I didn't hear it myself. Mary is also a member of NPHET. I think Dr. Glynn may have heard the interview. I
mean, I think the key takeaway for me from that interview was her final remarks, which were that we need to follow the science. And I think ultimately that's what we're all about. We're following the data and following the evidence. So we all want things to move faster than they are at the moment. We all want to get back to a level of normality where we can forget about COVID and forget about the pandemic. But ultimately, as advisors, as people who look at the evidence as it's published and assess it and liaise with colleagues in the HSE like Professor Cormack and Professor Keoghan, who look at the real world utility of these tests, we've got to be guided by the evidence and the science. And throughout this pandemic, we have tried to be guided by the science. And as Professor Horgan noted this morning, ultimately that's what we're all aspiring to do.
Okay. But you know, we have different levels of science, it seems, because we have EU states recognising the utility of antigen tests. Upwards of 36 antigen tests have been recognised by the EU Commission as being accepted for EU states. So that is one bar of scientific of science that needs to be exceeded and has been exceeded by those tests. So we now, what I'm hearing in this committee meeting is we have another bar, which is the real world testing of those tests in particular fields or in particular sectors. So I mean, what's difference about those two tests? Like, how does an antigen test meet a bar to be accepted by the EU Commission, but then doesn't meet a bar to be accepted by the Irish state for use in a particular sector? And there was a comment made earlier about carbonated beverages impacting the results of antigen tests, saying that they can be befouled by such. What academic piece of research is that based on? Because I just have never heard that before. Thank you.
I might ask Professors Cormack and Keoghan to come in on some of those questions, if I may.
Yeah.
Mark?
Well, just on the first one in relation to, everybody accepts that antigen tests applied to people who are asymptomatic will detect some people. PCR will detect more of them. So as I say, I go back again to the filter issue, is the filter that you use with an antigen test will let more through than the filter that you use if you're using a PCR test. So in any particular application, people may choose to use one type of filter or the other. But we have very clear evidence from the work that's been done, the validation that's been done here, that if you test 100 people who are infected with the antigen test, at most you will get 65% of them, and the other 35% that you would detect with PCR, you will not detect. So you choose the filter you want to use, an antigen test, and this is not a matter of opinion. Every study that I've seen done in any country will show you that antigen testing, any country that's done it will show you that antigen testing will miss about a third of asymptomatic people who are likely to be infectious at the time. So people may have all sorts of opinions, but I would pick up what Dr. Glenn says again, is what is the evidence? And sometimes the evidence is very uncomfortable, and sometimes I wish the evidence was different as well. But I think what we have to do is tell you what the evidence is. And if anyone can find publications that show publications by peer-reviewed scientists that show you that what I've just told you is wrong, well, then I'll change my opinion. But I've tried and I can't find them.
Okay. Dr. Keoghan, briefly.
If I can just show you now, I may need a bit of a hand with the camera to right in front here. So
you need to come over a bit further, Dr. Keoghan. Yeah, we have it. Yeah.
So this is a negative result. I'm not sure if it's.
You need to come back from the camera. You need to come back from the camera.
Yeah. Can people see?
That's fine.
There is a single line at the C bar. What I did to produce this morning, and obviously I wouldn't be handling it without gloves if it had any biological material, is I just put buffer on this. And this is the reason that self-testing is not acceptable for any sort of test to enable approach. So if you just put buffer with no sample, you get a negative result. The control line just tells you that diffusion has occurred. It doesn't indicate that there's any specimen in this test, unlike a PCR where you will get an invalid result if there is no RNA present.
Dr. Keoghan, we're very tight on time. Just get to the heart of the matter.
It's widely publicised on the internet that if you put, it's mostly done with Diet Coke, you can get a false positive. And this is done with tonic water because it doesn't stain down below. And this looks like a positive. And this is why, because you can produce a positive, this is why any sort of positivity based on self-testing is recommended, should be confirmed. Because these tests do not have a process control in them and are open to manipulation.
That's Dr. Keoghan, finally, you're talking about self-administered rapid antigen tests, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, but we're not talking about self-administered. We're talking about monitored.
Chair, I just think we like some references have been made to peer-reviewed journals, and now we're talking to the internet. You know, I think it's been a bad couple of days for Coca-Cola with Ronaldo, and now this has been quite a potent example now that's been put up, which I think is quite stunning, to be honest. So I think there's obviously a distrust of people here in terms of, I know if I was asymptomatic and used an antigen test, I'd want to know if I had COVID. I think most people, if not all, would. So I'm very concerned in terms of what we've just seen there, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move now to
on the performance that we've now established through the validation study here. Of people who are asymptomatic with the antigen test that was used in that, the risk of infection or not, a coin toss is effectively the level of performance of the test. That's the reality. That's evidence that we've produced from validation.
Sorry, Dr. Honan. Dr. Honan, I have to take
I haven't heard anybody pointing towards published evidence.
Dr. Honan,
as Professor Cormacan says, tells us that our advice in respect of this is incorrect. In other words, the use in asymptomatic populations and how reliable the test will be.
With due respect,
if 6 of us in the room are infected and you test it with the antigen test, if the 6 of us are infected and you test the 6 of us with the antigen test, you missed.
Dr. Cormacan, with due respect, right? At their most infectious, and we're talking about the spread of the infection, at their most infectious, it's called the CT score of less than 25 or less than 30. Is it not fair to say that rapid antigen testing will detect the virus at that level? So, yes, over the full spread. So it's not correct to say.
No, a CT test, an antigen test with a CT value of less than 30 in our studies, Mary, will detect 7 out of 10.
And what about less than 25?
At less than 25, 80%.
And that's very, very high. That's at the rate of PCR test. So I think it's important that...
No, it's not correct, Deputy.
That's not correct. That's low. That's with people who are highly likely to be infectious. So then the question is if one of those 2 people that you missed is the person sitting beside you on the airplane and they could have been detected by PCR, which test would you like us to have used?
Yeah, but I'd like to have an antigen test pre-boarding, which might pick up something that was missed by PCR 3 days before. I just need to move to...
Sorry, Chair, just add one other point around this concept of infectiousness above a CT of 25 or a CT of 30, again, unfortunately, it's something where opinion and comment are being misinterpreted as evidence. Virus is culturable, live virus is retrievable, and a CT has been demonstrated a CT of up to 37. It won't be recoverable in 100% of individuals with a CT of 37, but it is recoverable at that level. So we need to be very careful about just assuming that a CT of greater than 25 or greater than 30 is not infectious or does not contain viable virus. We don't yet know the infectious dose of SARS coronavirus type 2. So anybody who tells us that they do and can correlate it with the CT value, unfortunately, is misleading the committee.
Thank you. Can I now move to Deputy Crowe? 7 minutes, Deputy Crowe. I'm going to go. I have 3 members. I'm going to stick that we try and get those members in. Well, 2 to committee, and then there'll be less time for the non-members. So, Deputy Crowe. Deputy Crowe. We'll now move to Deputy Senator Jerry Buttimer.
Good morning, Caherlick, and welcome to our guests. I really hope we can, Caherlick, have the witnesses back again in a less combative, adversarial manner. I regret the tone of the meeting from a personal perspective. Dr. Glynn, could I ask you, if I heard your remarks correctly, did you say in your reply that antigen testing was not discussed by NPHET?
No, I said the opposite. The antigen testing would have been discussed in its various guises.
Yes, sorry, but in the context of aviation.
Not that I recall specifically, but we would not discuss the specific use of a test in a specific setting.
Okay. Why wouldn't it have been done specifically for aviation or for sporting or cultural events?
Because NPHET wouldn't have as we've said previously, like the individual sectors need to bring their expertise to whether or not these tests should be piloted, can bring additional value over and above the basic public health measures that have kept so many so safe over the past 18 months. And ultimately, if there's evidence to support the use of these tests in a particular setting, well then, that advice will be looked at and provided onwards in the positive sense.
Yet in the context of face coverings or masks, NPHET revised this position from its beginning, where it said face masks weren't necessary in public transport or in shops, and on the 10th of August you made it mandatory, so you changed your position. Why wouldn't, in the context of aviation or sporting or cultural events, that have been reviewed?
Would you prefer that we never changed our position?
No, I didn't say that at all. I asked a specific question. I wasn't being in any way belligerent or confrontational. I asked in the context of aviation, in the context of antigen testing, as to why NPHET didn't, if in parallel with face coverings, you did change your position. And I have no difficulty with people changing their positions. I'm in the profession where we do that all the time.
So ultimately, Deputy, as we've said throughout this meeting, if we can be shown evidence, scientific evidence, or indeed real-world utility, real-world value of these tests in a real-world setting, whether it's aviation or any other setting, we will obviously promote the use of that test or that modality. It's in none of our interests. I think, and I'd agree with you about the combative nature of this. I think that there's a really unfortunate narrative has grown up around this, that there's people completely opposed to antigen testing and people who think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Neither of those things are the truth. It's a question of using it in appropriate settings as one more intervention. And there's no reason in the world why we wouldn't want antigen testing to be used where it brings an additional level of safety and reduces risk, whether that's aviation or sport or anywhere else. But ultimately, we have a responsibility to make sure that also we give the advice that's based on science, and that we don't say that an event or an activity that is otherwise unsafe at a given point in time, given the prevailing epidemiological situation, should go ahead just because there's antigen testing. If antigen testing or any other testing or other modality doesn't make up for the risk that's posed by that event or that activity, we've got to weigh all of those things up at a given point in time and give the advice as it stands. But of course, we'll change our advice. We would love to see evidence that these tests have improved, that there's real world evidence behind them, that they can bring something additional so we can all move on from this.
And on that point, could I just draw your attention to the Lancet.com peer review of 100,000 air traffic or air passengers in the United States who use supervised rapid antigen testing? And I know time won't allow us to have a commentary on that. But I think it is important, and you talk about the pilot schemes in aviation. We did stop the world rightly, and travel was stopped, and therefore there was a limited allowance for that. Could I just ask Dr. Houlihan, and I think Dr. Houlihan, you will know me from my time as chair of the health committee, I've never been combative or adversarial in the chair, and I've always at all times sought to protect members and witnesses. In the context of AstraZeneca, could I just ask a question not related to antigen testing, if that's possible?
Sorry, you asked me. Sorry, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just in the context, and I appreciate that we're all trying to keep everybody safe. In the context of AstraZeneca, has NPHET given any consideration to two things? One, that a member of the public who's got the first dose of AstraZeneca could have a second dose, which would be a Pfizer one. And then secondly, in the context of a booster shot, much like the flu shot, do you see us having a yearly one? And if it is, could we make a recommendation that there would be a booster shot as a Pfizer shot? And my final question to you, Dr. Houlihan, is in the context of the earlier questions to Dr. Glynn around pilot proposals in aviation, if this committee made a proposal and it was passed on to you as the Chief Medical Officer, what would your view on that be? And can I finally just thank you all for your work in the last year and a half. We can disagree on many things and agree on lots of things, but just to thank you for your work on behalf of the people.
Dr. Honan, to direct questions.
Come in briefly because I was asked a question about the Lancet study. This is precisely the issue that we're talking about. That is a simulation study. It's a modelling study. It's people sitting at a computer and estimating what might happen if we do this in this type of setting. It's not real world evidence of real world utility. And that's what we need.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's why I raised the issue, just to have a debate, and I'm not in any way confrontational, and I would not want you to think that I am.
Well, I think robust discussion, Dr. Houlihan would appreciate, is always healthy. So, Dr. Houlihan, on the question on AstraZeneca.
Yeah, I'm going to come back on Deputy Butler's question. So, first of all, in relation to any experience I ever had of you as chair of the Health Committee, your recollection is exactly the same as mine. It was always an experience I enjoyed and relished, and I hope that we gave good evidence and supported your work in the committee during that time. That's exactly as I remember it. In relation, just in broad terms, to our ambition here is to find ourselves in a situation where two things happen. One, we get the level of the disease into this country down to a level that we think we can safely resume activity. And so far, we've been making good progress as a country in relation to that through the work that people have been doing. And if anything, we're seeing an improved situation epidemiologically. We're taking confidence from that, but maybe not getting ahead of ourselves too much in terms of what there's still potential for things to go wrong. But that's not dissuading us at the moment from staying the course that we're on. That's really encouraging. And we're getting people vaccinated at a very, very high rate in terms of the acceptance of that vaccination and in terms of the numbers the HSE are getting through a very impressive programme of vaccination that's giving people increasing protection. That's the strategy. It's working. And we want to be in a situation whereby we can see the economy and society in all of its manifestations returning when it's appropriate and safe to do so without a dependence on any form of testing. And that we don't think we can find ourselves, and this is what the essence of the green light that we spoke about is all about, that we won't find ourselves in a situation whereby something is unsafe from our point of view, but is now rendered safe simply through the use of antigen tests. Okay. Because we haven't seen any evidence that would give us assurance that we think something that was inherently unsafe can now be rendered safe because people are using antigen testing. And I think the premise, not of a lot of what you're saying, Deputy, but a lot of what is being said in general terms by people, the premise is that we would use it in these green lights. We would be able to resume this activity, named activity, whatever it may be, if only we were using antigen testing. Okay. And that is an implied use in a green light way for asymptomatic populations. And there is no published evidence at all. Very few studies, in fact, have looked at this question in any setting, and those that have not produced encouraging results.
We're very tight in time.
AstraZeneca, yeah, please.
Yeah, on the AstraZeneca question, So NIAC has given advice, and the process, the NIAC gives that advice through me and ultimately through to the Minister. They have looked at that question already. The evidence so far has not given them a call to conclude, but I think we can anticipate, because there are a number of studies, there's one in Spain, there's one in the UK, that may well change the situation in relation to the mixing, as spoke. Heterologous is the term, but the mixing of vaccine doses. It hasn't been as yet recommended in this country. It's really important now, people in the 60 to 69 age group and any other people who are in other age groups that are receiving. I have a daughter who's 20 years of age who's had a first dose and is due a second dose of AstraZeneca. I'm quite happy to recommend that she gets it. And that's our position. On the question, which is kind of related around boosters, some element of that is something that we'll be looking at through NIAC over the course of the coming weeks. It's a very good question that you're raising. We think there will be some role to play on that, but we want to take a careful look at the evidence as we move now through to the kind of optimistic situation whereby we can look to, let's say, August, September time, and the great majority of the people who are currently the target of our vaccination programme having been vaccinated.
Thanks, Dr. Honan. We'll now move to Deputy Crowe. Deputy Crowe.
Thanks, Chairman. Chairman, just to confirm, I'm in the convention centre. I had to move between while the committee was taking place here. Just to welcome Dr. Houlihan, Dr. Glean, and all of the team who are here today, and to thank you, I suppose, for your role and efforts over the past 12 or 15 months or so. So there's a number of points I wish to get to immediately. First of all, I very much take the view that rapid antigen testing is a cheap, fast, uncomplicated, and most importantly of all, safe way of testing people before they travel. I think we've seen 17 or so European countries embrace this. The points I would like to make, I suppose, essentially are, if you take a PCR test 3 days before you depart, in that 3-day interim period between testing and boarding your flight, you will handle hundreds of door handles, flush hundreds of loos, turn taps, hand dryers, and multiple things. There's multiple opportunities for an individual to pick up the COVID virus elsewhere. And I think whilst PCR test is dubbed the gold standard, it doesn't capture everything. It's rather akin to being breathalyzed a few hours before you go down to your local pub. It doesn't capture all the information. It doesn't really capture the more salient information in terms of antigen levels at the point of departure, in my opinion. And I just want to ask, why wouldn't we so far, I know that you're talking about testing in the field, but why wouldn't we so far look at a parallel regime, not a competing regime, but a parallel regime of antigen testing to capture the most up-to-date data, Dr. Houlihan, before someone boards their flight?
It's a plausible scenario, but it's simply not true. So if I'm due to take a flight in 72 hours' time, and I'm swabbed right now, you're absolutely right. I could pick up the virus in the next 72 hours. If I'm swabbed right now, and I go out that door, and I'm immediately exposed to the virus and pick it up, it's going to take 3 to 4 days for that virus to replicate inside me before it's detectable by any test, and probably longer before it's detectable by a rapid antigen test. So the difficulty is I'll have taken my flight and arrived at my destination before I'm in any way likely to be detectable. So this is why we have this caution around how frequently do you test, and it depends on all kinds of things like prevalence. So it hasn't been tested, so there hasn't been a proper study done. And I can't say a rapid antigen test definitively wouldn't pick up an exposure that occurred after my swabbing. It may detect an exposure that occurred before my swabbing. But it's quite unlikely, given the evidence that we have, that being swabbed for PCR up to 72 hours before could be improved upon by adding an antigen test up to 48 hours before I board the flight.
So if I can just, I have a few more. You can come in again in a moment if you don't mind. A few.
Yeah, I think everybody accepts that adding in an antigen test couldn't make things less safe, I think. The problem is it would make things more difficult. And the reason that people are promoting it is as an alternative. But of course, if you had the PCR test and you had the antigen test, it wouldn't make things less safe.
Okay. So look, I suppose there's different. We've heard differing stuff from the scientific field. I just want to quote a small thing here from the assistant professor of virology at UCD, Dr. Gerald Barry, and these are his quotes. It's an absolute no-brainer he says, and he can't understand, further quotation, can't understand why we are not looking at this, explaining it to people, teaching them how to use it and rolling it out on a mass basis. I think there's an overwhelming school of scientific thought. Indeed, Professor Ferguson, who's completed a report for government recommending the implementation of this. Just in terms of moving on, you're suggesting that you need to do in-the-field evaluations. I know there's been a number of matches over the weekend where you've had low attendances allowed, and you're examining a number of situations. In terms of testing a flight, and I suggested here just about 3 or 4 weeks ago that we would use this interim period between now and July 19th to test a flight between perhaps Ireland and the UK, inbound and outbound, to allow for antigen testing of passengers to be used as the test case of that. In terms of advancing that, just like you've advanced matches and concerts at the weekend, who needs to give the green light here? And is there pushback at any level, be it departmental, from NIAC, from NPHET, from government? Have you sought this? Has it been discussed? Is there pushback on doing a test on a flight? And if there isn't, when will it happen?
I might bring in some others on the comments that the specific comments that you refer to. But in relation to these things that you say we've advised on, yes, we have advised on, as you say, the return of outdoor activities and matches. And the reason that matches are happening all over the country now and there's 100 people in a position to attend is because we provided advice that we believed, because of the prevailing epidemiological situation and vaccination status, that we thought it was safe for us to cautiously but ambitiously move on to that level of easing of restrictions without the dependence on testing. So there isn't a requirement on testing applying in any of those settings. People are free now to go to a match. We give public health advice.
I meant as in test events. There are test events to see how life will progress over the summer and autumn months. There are test events. But in terms of testing flights, what's today in terms of testing a flight, using it as a test case, antigen tested passengers flying over and back between Britain between now and 19th of July?
And I want, like, with the prevalence of the disease as it stands in this country at the moment of about 0.1%. We know from a number of different publications, and it was referred to recently or earlier, the recently published Infectious Disease Society of America talks about these tests not really being reliable in a prevalence of less than 5%. That's our experience. That's what our data is telling us. We can't rely on the tests at this low level of prevalence. So I'm just not clear what you would be testing and testing one flight in that situation, where the probability on a flight of 150 people have only been infected is very, very low.
Okay, but just where this validation exercise, a number of you have referred to, where will it take place, when, how, and who needs to sanction it? I mean, that's what we really want to see between now and July 19th. We want to see this tested, proven in the scientific field and implemented when people get back on planes again.
Just so you're clear in our advice, is that so the decision has been made in relation to the 19th of July. We think it would be appropriate and safe for individuals who are vaccinated and to take all the other precautions that we recommended here in whatever country they're travelling to travel to other countries where the use of the digital green cert and so on supports that travel. Other areas of low incidence, and we think that would be safe without the need for PCR testing. So in that situation, to support that, there's no need for any validation, or without the need for any form of testing, I should say. There's no need for validation because we think it's safe and appropriate because the disease incidence is low.
Yeah.
But we're specifically all here today wondering, you've referred to the outcome of a validation exercise. When will that validation exercise relating to antigen testing, relating to international aviation, when will that happen?
I think you may have misunderstood. So I'm not pointing to any specific validation exercise that we're aware of taking place. I'm pointing to the fact that to support the use of antigen tests in other settings other than those where we know they have been established to be effective and viable, we would need further validation studies to be carried out. That's the position as advocated by all national bodies.
Okay, I just want to say, we've heard you're sceptical of it. You've outlined a number of the arguments in that regard. 17 EU countries have embraced this, and they embrace this on a scientific basis. There is a huge sharing of information these days, over and back, whether it be the EMA, whether it be engaged with your counterparts in other countries. But I think we need to embrace as well that there is scientific advice and validation in other European countries. There are countries willing to fully embrace this. The fact remains, on July 19th, when people go to book flights, they might get their €40 return, bargain basement, air ticket with Ryanair, but it'll cost them hundreds to get tested. That'll be a barrier. That'll be a barrier to international travel. Antigen is safe, It's safe, it's cheap, and what
travel.
I've seen, if I can, I'm nearly finished. What I've seen here today is we're talking about fizzy water and Coca-Cola, how this can result in fake results. We're talking about scientific people, qualified people doing this. This isn't TikTok or Facebook or anything like that. We want this done scientifically, laboratory-wise, just as PCR is done. That's the realm we want antigen to exist, to coexist with PCR, to make flights safe, affordable, and safe again.
We as a committee, Dr. Hoolan,
we want to see the resumption not dependent on any of that form of testing.
Okay.
We don't think it's viable enough for the reasons that we've already set out. But that if people are vaccinated and are following the other public health measures, we think it will be safe for airline travel to resume without the reliance on that testing. So the question will be then, for what purpose would that validation exercise be done at this point in time?
And Dr. Hoolan, can I ask you a question? Come the 19th of July, what will happen with the common travel area with the Delta variant? So will the same apply for people from the 19th of July that are flying over and back to the UK, that they're fully vaccinated, that they will not require to either get a test or require to isolate? And if people are not validated, are not vaccinated, you will still require a PCR test. So can you just understand that from the 19th of July? So you're signalling that what's being proposed by government you're in agreement with, but can I just deal in terms of the UK, the common travel area is hugely important to us. At the moment, you could have to quarantine up to 14 days with tests 5 days and 10 days. What will happen on the 19th of July for travel over and back from the UK, which is vital to us in terms of connectivity?
So what I'd say is, like, the 19th of July is 5 weeks away. The situation we find ourselves in at the moment now is the position epidemiologically in the UK is probably the most worrying across Europe. The disease is increasing in incidence. Dr. Glynn gave an outline earlier on. The doubling time is less than a week in many parts of the country. The infection is rising in terms of its incidence quickly. Over 90% of the spread of that infection is now attributable to this new Delta variant, which makes it relatively unique in comparison to other countries. And so we're genuinely concerned about that. And it'd be impossible to predict where we will find ourselves in 5 weeks' time in respect of where the UK will be, because I think the UK themselves are concerned. They're pausing some of their own measures for that particular reason. I'm sure you're aware of that. What we'll keep monitoring. And we think at this point in time that the measures that we've now recommended in respect of, and the decision that government has made in respect of travel within these islands, are proportional to what is now an increasing concern that we have about the transmission of that particular variant. And as and when we continue to see, if you like, that situation either disapproving or hopefully improving, we'll give advice accordingly over the course of the weeks between now and the 19th of July.
Thanks, Dr. Briefly, Deputy Crowe, to finalise.
Yeah, look, I'm done. All I want to say is that we base everything we've spoken about here over the last number of weeks on science. We are not trying to shortchange passengers or put them at any risk level. We've taken in the best expert advice. And I think it's important that we do look at a field evaluation, as you're saying. But to do that between now and July 19th, there's no point delaying. We don't know. The COVID situation is improving week on week. It's going really, really well in terms of vaccinations. But we don't know what things are going to be like in the autumn. We need to have a regime that's cheap and safe for people to travel internationally.
Thanks, Deputy Crowe.
Thank you.
Senator Harkin, 7 minutes. Senator Harkin, you're on mute, Senator Harkin. You're still on mute.
Chair, if I might just raise, just at this end, we've been together in the room for in excess of 2 hours. But we're obviously willing to support the committee in all of its work.
We'll be concluding in about 6 minutes, Dr. Hoolan. Is that okay?
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for your indulgence. Senator Harkin.
Thanks, Cahirlock, and thanks very much to the CMO and his team for everything you've been doing in the last 15 months, and it is very much appreciated by all of the Irish people, and I just want to put that on the record. And, but from this committee's point of view, we are the Transport Committee, and obviously we have a role to play in terms of trying to get Irish aviation in particular back up and running. which also has a further impact on things like tourism and hospitality in general. And I know all of those areas are areas that you have risk on. And back last Christmas, I'm sure there was a reason why you wanted nobody going anywhere, nobody doing anything, and everybody staying at home. But thankfully, through the efforts of the Irish people and indeed through your own direction, we're in a much, much happier, better place. I was hoping that you can clarify, just for the avoidance of any doubt, that post the 19th of July, somebody who's fully vaccinated, and I'd like you just to confirm that fully vaccinated, exactly what that means is you've got your 2 doses or your 1 dose, and it's maybe 2 weeks after that. Is that the window you're talking about? That fully vaccinated means you can travel without the need for a test, inbound or outbound. Obviously, other countries may have their own rules, but in terms of Irish entry and exit from Ireland, is that what you're saying? That people fully vaccinated won't need any PCR or antigen test?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, that's something that I think a lot of people may not. My concern is that, and I've no problem having an antigen test pilot. I could sense from yourselves that you really have to rely on evidence of antigen tests being reliable, and you want a study. If you were to accept them as valid, you want a study. But I think what you're saying is, if I'm right, is that the amount of time taken to do a proper study we'd be almost at the 19th of July anyway.
And then some, definitely, you're right.
Yeah. Okay. There have been, obviously there's the guts of 140,000 people in Irish aviation, many of whom are watching this today. And their concern was that antigen tests were being kind of written off. But what you're now saying is that there won't be a need for antigen tests from the 19th of July onwards, and any test that you'd be relying on will take longer than that. We have had various committee meetings, and I'm only a recent member to this committee, about antigen testing in the last few months, and indeed one last week with Professor Michael Mina, who I think is doing a seminar that you've been invited to, a webinar next week. Would you be willing to meet them? I know they've invited you. They've asked me to put the question to you. Are you in a position to maybe meet them and even explain to them that what you're advocating from next week or from now in terms of the 19th of July is that PCR and antigen tests will not be required exiting and entering Ireland?
You've understood what we're saying very clearly in what you've said. I'm happy to explain it to anybody. I haven't seen an invitation. I'm not doubting that an invitation exists. I get a lot of invitations to lots of different things.
I don't doubt it.
Can I tell you that it's a full-time job keeping the Minister, the Cabinet Committee and the various Oireachtas committees and the public informed of the things we need to inform them. So I'd be parsimonious, if you like, in terms of my attendance at things involving people outside of the country.
Okay.
I think if my understanding is there was 350 pilots outside the Department of Health this morning, and clearly these people have had their own income and their own existence decimated in the last 15 months, along with many other people in other sectors. And I think they would love to get, maybe it might only be a half an hour or 45 minutes if it was possible. I would hope that you could meet them, obviously in the same way that you're meeting us, you wouldn't have to travel to meet them or whatever. But if I could ask you to look as favourably as possible as you can on that request, I think it would be very much appreciated by the entire aviation industry, many of whom I'm sure are watching today. Much of what I've wanted to ask or might have asked has been asked and has been covered. What I would like to know, though, is in terms of the PCR and antigen tests, we're saying that, is it from every country, or will we still have these kind of mandatory hotel quarantine countries? Will we still have areas of risk around the world that we'll be restricting? Or are you saying that people in Ireland can go on the Ryanair or the Aer Lingus or any other website, book flights to anywhere they want to go, won't need a test to leave Ireland and won't need a test to come back? Or is it only within the EU, or what's the implications, I suppose, of different countries' travel?
And Dr. Hoolens, when you're answering that, it's only in relation to fully vaccinated people there'll be no test. People that are unvaccinated or only half vaccinated, they'll still require a PCR test.
I should have given a slightly longer answer to the Senator's question, because he did ask, in fairness to you, what exactly was meant by fully vaccinated. It's slightly different, as you know, for different vaccines, the duration of time. Yeah. So for Moderna, it's 2 weeks after the second dose, which is 6 weeks in your first dose. For Pfizer, it's 1 week after the second dose, which is 5 weeks. In AZ, it's 2 weeks after the second dose, for the purpose, at least, of travel. We have a lower level, if I can put it that way, in respect of some of the activities within the country, but we're just talking about travel now, and then 2 weeks after the single-dose Janssen vaccine. So it's a slightly different period of time for each one, but it also includes, I should have pointed this out, where there's PCR evidence of infection within the last 9 months, that, in other words, recovery, where evidence of recovery. That for many countries will be a sizable percentage of the population. It could be as many as 10% of the population in this country with PCR infection demonstrated. So all of those would be the kind of qualifying criteria. But yes, unvaccinated people would still have to go through the testing arrangements. And we'd need to retain an ability to be able to look, because it can happen, and we won't rule out this possibility. And unfortunately, we see it happening in our nearest neighbour, a surge of infection caused by a genuine variant of concern, where that requires us to take action. And I think the arrangements that have been put in place at an EU level make provisions for some of those kinds of arrangements, an emergency break as it is called, to be applied if those concerns.
Thanks, Doctor. We have 2 non-members. 2 minutes.
Sorry, Ciarán.
Yes, Senator Corkin, yeah.
Yeah, just to thank the members for it, but just in terms of, is it the case that unless from the 19th of July for fully vaccinated people, and I appreciate your clarification of what that means for different vaccines, that they can book flights to anywhere and they won't be required by the Irish authorities, but they could, I suppose, be required in other countries to have tests of varying degrees. Would that be the case?
Yeah, it's I would say complexity to it, but like the arrangements that apply within the EU to travel between member states, that will be the case. Europe as an entity is then attempting to put in place a common arrangement to apply to travel from third countries for people coming into Europe.
But what about places like America or North Africa or Australia or the UAE or Dubai or various other parts of the world? What's the story after the 19th of July with them?
And that's exactly that's what Europe is attempting to do, is to put in place recognition for all those other countries.
Oh, so Europe as a whole will be looking at post 19th of July, if you like, from an Irish perspective.
Senator Harkin, you'll have to conclude, because
I'm just trying to. I mean, thanks, Ciarán. And I mean, I haven't.
Just have to.
I'm trying not to delay the meeting. It's just to make the case that I'd like clarity as to post 19th of July. The EU, you're saying, is going to have rules about where Ireland can go without a vaccine, or once vaccinated can go without a PCR or antigen test.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Two
Thank you,
non-members. We're very tight in time. 2 minutes each. No more. First, Deputy McNamara, and secondly, Deputy Daly. 2 minutes. You're on mute. You're on mute, Deputy McNamara. You're on mute. Deputy McNamara, you're still on mute.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You're okay, yeah.
The report that was compiled by Professor Ferguson, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, I want to come back to that. I've looked at the minutes of NPHET, and nowhere was it on the agenda to discuss it, nowhere is it minuted that it was discussed, notwithstanding the fact that, as I say, Professor Ferguson is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, and also he chaired a panel of experts. Is it correct to say that it wasn't discussed by NPHET? And it's like a brief response, because I have a couple of other questions to ask.
I'm limiting you to the 2 minutes, Deputy McNamara, because I'm conscious of safety for...
Okay, then yes or no, Professor, or Dr. Holohan, as you chair NPHET, can you confirm it was or wasn't discussed?
We dealt with this question earlier, Deputy. I indicated that for personal reasons I wasn't in the chair during that time period. The Minister set up the process and designed it, if you like, requested the process to report directly back to the Minister.
So it wasn't discussed. Thank you.
Dr. Glynn was in the chair during that time period. I did say all this earlier on. Yeah.
Yes. But it wasn't discussed. Okay. You said that there's a paucity of, or all of you collectively said that there's a paucity of reports pointing to the efficacy of antigen testing in the real world. DG Sante have put forward a list of agreed antigen tests that's approved by the Health Security Committee of the European Union.
Final question, Deputy McNamara.
That Health Security Committee is comprised of ministries of health across the European Union. Are you saying that they're wrong in the stance that they have taken, and you're right, because that's quite a statement to make, given how the Health Security Committee of the EU is comprised?
Dr. Holohan, briefly.
Yeah, well, I didn't make that statement. You're suggesting that's the case, but I didn't make that statement.
Do you recognise the antigen tests that are included in the annexes to the agreed list of antigen tests that was published on the 19th of May?
So they're published there for a whole variety of different purposes. I'm sure you're aware of that. Dr. Keoghan will
very
address
briefly,
that point.
Dr. Keoghan, very briefly.
If you could be brief, Dr. Keoghan, and will those antigen tests be recognised for entry to Ireland? And as Dr. Keoghan is speaking, I'd just like to make one other observation. Earlier, Dr. Keoghan, you said that the validation couldn't be carried out while the sector is shut down, yet the sector can't open up without antigen testing because of the cost involved in PCR testing. That's an extraordinary exercise in circular reasoning, I have to put it to you.
Okay, so I'm going to let some of those points that Deputy McNamara raised have been dealt with already. You have a particular view, you want it to be validated. Can we, Professor?
No, I have a question to ask. Will NPHET recognise the list of antigen tests in the common agreed list provided by DG Santé, approved by the Health Security Committee on the 19th of May? That's not a loaded question. That's will they recognise it, A, and will they recognise it, B, for the purpose of travel into this
very
state?
Quickly, Dr.
Keoghan was attempting to answer the question, but just to say to you, the premise in which you've posed it now and you made clear is a premise in which testing would continue to exist as a prerequisite to travel. Our ambition is to see the return of travel without a dependence on testing, because we've rendered it in relative terms safe, because incidence is low and vaccination uptake is high. Okay. That's where we want to be. Dr. Keoghan.
What happens when we don't get there?
We are going to get there.
All right.
So if I could answer the questions. The list of antigen tests is under discussion. It has become very clear that different countries have different criteria for approving antigen tests.
I'm talking about the agreed list by the DG Santé, not different countries. The agreed list by the European Commission's DG Santé.
With respect, could I please answer and then I supplementary?
Please answer the question I asked, not a different question.
Deputy McNamara, will you just allow the witness to answer, because we need to conclude. I'm conscious of health conditions where Dr. Hull and his colleagues are. Dr. Keoghan, just to conclude.
So there is a technical working group meeting more than weekly to review the antigen tests and update the list. As more evidence becomes available, more tests may be added, some may be removed from the list. This is a living document and it will move with the science. In terms of whether antigen testing will be accepted for entry into Ireland, that is a government decision, but many member states have not declared that they will accept antigen testing. So it is not something for me to answer whether these antigen tests on the DG Santé list will be accepted. There was another question in the middle about validations in relation to, and you referred to costs. It's really important to be aware that while the reagents to do an antigen test are cheap, the technical scientific time is expensive.
Okay.
And if you look at the costs of PCR tests, they are actually moving down to be much closer to the cost of getting a professionally delivered.
Thanks, Dr. Keoghan. I'm going to move now, Deputy Daly. I'm going to have to limit you to absolute 2 minutes, because I'm conscious of...
Absolutely, no problem. Actually, the questions I was going to ask on antigen testing have already been answered, so I just might move on to one, seeing as we're on the Transport Committee. When will the distancing requirements, or when we will have clarity on distancing requirements for school transport for the coming year? We have had in my van in North Kerry school buses cancelled, and pupils are actually literally on the side of the road. And one other question, which is in response to something which was brought up by, I think it was Dr. Holohan, about football matches. Trial events, as we know, have been taking place, but there are football matches which we lost out on taking place all over Europe. And in advance of summer championship matches, do you think we will be in a position to accelerate the percentage of people who are allowed to attend matches during the summer?
That's less than a minute.
Dr. Honan, 2 quick questions.
We have already accelerated that. Our original plan, going back to the advice that we provided to government in April, was that we didn't see any outdoor gatherings taking place during the month of June. Actually, because of how things went for us, we thought we'd bring that forward, and now up to 100 people can attend, not just a match, but any outdoor gathering during the month of June, and we'll increase that further in July on the assumption that things stay as they are, and we'll continue to grow from there without a dependence or on antigen testing or anything else. Because we think that the disease incidence is low enough to enable us to do that. And increasingly, we're getting more people vaccinated. And we'll continue to say to people, look, if you're not vaccinated, maybe you should stay away from the match. But if you are vaccinated, you can regard that as something safe that you can do. And I was at a match myself last Saturday evening in those circumstances. And I think that it's something that's safe for us to resume. The first question that you asked, sorry.
First question.
Finish that one. Do you think it'll increase much beyond 10%, or have you any idea on the percentages for the capacity of grounds? And the first question was about distancing requirement for school transport.
Okay, briefly, yeah.
I don't suggest that your question is hypothetical. It's not. I think that as we move through the summer, so long as we stay on track and things don't go wrong in terms of the Delta variant or some surge in infection that we don't want to see happening, if we can stay on the path that we're on at the moment epidemiologically, we'll continue to increase during July and during August. And if we get to the end of August and we haven't seen a challenge, we think at that stage we'll have sufficiently high levels of vaccination. It will remain to be seen that we get the levels of vaccination that we hope to get by then, that we should be able to resume much closer to normal activity in terms of that kind of, and the sector itself then putting in place arrangements for that.
And are you satisfied that there hasn't been any spikes as a result of all the matches taking place around Europe, or are you keeping an eye on that?
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Most of Europe is continuing to move in an encouraging situation disease-wise in terms of the incidence. It's falling in many countries around Europe. The UK is not the only, but is the main exception to that. And because of the variant over there, that's why we're particularly concerned about that, and we're watching that closely. You asked about the social distancing. We will be looking at that as just part of the general look at evidence as the summer progresses. If we think that the circumstances are right in transmission terms and in vaccination terms for us to ease any of these measures, including social distancing, and we understand the impact that has on, as you say, school transport, or the impact that might have on resumption of third-level education at the time.
Finally, and this is my last question.
No. Sorry, Deputy, I have to move on. Deputy Daly,
matches that have been taking place.
We've allowed you to come in.
Those matches across Europe are all fairly recent. They're all in the last week or two. It's a bit too early to be concluding that there haven't been problems, if you know what I mean. But we'll keep an eye on all of that, I can assure you of that.
Dr. Hullen,
there hasn't been thus far.
When do you expect we'll have herd immunity in Ireland? When will we get to that 70%? When will that happen, Dr. Hullen, do you believe?
Well, I think the HSE is making really good progress in getting vaccination out, and the public is really making great use of that in terms of its take-up of the vaccination. We hope that will continue as we move down through the age groups. And the further we can get, the safer we will be. I think that's the message that we would want to give in relation to vaccination. If you're called to register, register. If you've been called for a vaccination, turn up and get vaccinated. We've got very effective and safe vaccine use, and we're encouraging people to come forward for those vaccines. So we're not going to put a ceiling on it at this point in time. Okay. As I'm sure you know, we will have questions to address around the possible use of these vaccines in the under 16s, and we look at all of those kinds of questions in the context of.
So look, finally, after a long meeting, and I hope a productive one, you will appreciate, Dr. Hullen and your colleagues, there's huge frustration in the aviation sector. So we as a committee are duty bound to raise the issues. What has come out of today is that we as a committee will follow up on requesting that a pilot scheme will be set up in terms of a flight to see the role that antigen testing could play in aviation. I understand, Dr. Hullen, that the objective is that everyone's fully vaccinated. There's no requirement for testing. However, you will still have people that are unvaccinated. So it's just something, maybe there's a body of work to be done there. We'll very much follow up with that with the Department of Transport and obviously the Department of Health. We want to acknowledge the phenomenal work you've done. I would certainly say, Dr. Hullen, it's fair to say that you've been the guardian of public health in a very good way in terms of with COVID. But we are now coming out of, hopefully, the pandemic. Aviation is a critical feature for us here, around 140,000 people. We want to see how it can be done in terms of, I suppose, what rapid antigen testing can assist in that process. In no way replacing, but being complementary to PCR testing, which is the gold standard. So thank you very much, Dr. Honan and your colleagues, for making yourself available today.
Can I say to you, Chair, and the committee, that yeah, we share that aspiration. We share it personally as well as professionally. Yeah. We'd be able to see a safe resumption as early as possible of airline travel, unfettered by testing and any other requirements. So to see that returning as soon as possible, that's where we want to be. And I'm sure I speak for the entire NPHET when I say that, and certainly speak for the people in the room here today. That's where we want to be. We have no, let's say, predetermined disposition against any particular test or technology that will help us in getting there, and that's where we want to be.
But validated, but validated.
Because I think the fact that we're not in the same physical location and the fact that we're dependent on an IT system we've been slightly out of sync with each other. It hasn't been ideal, I know, from your point of view in terms of how we'd normally be present at a committee, and so our apologies for that. But I hope we've been able to make ourselves understood.
Yeah. Dr. Holan, we'll hopefully have you back in and your colleagues in person when we'll say the vaccination program rolls out that bit further, and we can have further exchange. And we thank you very much for taking time to come to our committee, which you've done previously. Certainly there have been elements that have been robust, but I think people's views are genuinely held. But we thank you for the phenomenal work you've done, and we wish you well into the future. I would like to thank Dr. Holan, Dr. Glenn, Professor Nolan, Dr. De Gascoigne, Professor Keoghan and Professor Cormack for attending today's engagement with the committee. We look forward to further engagement. The meeting is now adjourned. The next meeting in joint committee will be a private meeting of the committee at 4 p.m. on Tuesday next, the 22nd of June. Thank you all very much for your forbearance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.